Good evening and welcome back to Almighty Sleep. The story of American independence does not begin with fireworks or founding fathers in powdered wigs. It begins much earlier, in the slow collision of worlds, the accumulation of grievances too small to notice until they were too large to ignore, and the extraordinary moment when a group of colonial farmers, lawyers and dreamers looked at the most powerful empire on earth and said, plainly and without flinching, no. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum softly in the background, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. A new world, already old. Before we get to the revolution, before we get to the tea and the taxes and the pamphlets and the cannons, we have to begin where all honest histories of America must begin. Not in 1776, not in 1607, not even in 1492. We have to begin thousands of years earlier, on a continent that was already ancient, already populated, already layered with history long before a single European ship appeared on the horizon. The land that would eventually be called North America had been home to human beings for at least 15,000 years, possibly much longer. These were not primitive wanderers living in a state of nature, which is how later European settlers would often describe them, mostly to justify taking their land. They were complex, sophisticated, deeply rooted peoples with languages, governments, trade networks, agricultural systems and spiritual traditions as intricate as anything being developed simultaneously in Europe or Asia. In the northeast, the Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, had built one of the most sophisticated political systems anywhere in the world. The Confederacy united 5 nations, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga and the Seneca, under a shared constitution known as the Great Law of Peace. This was not a loose arrangement of tribes who occasionally cooperated. It was a functioning democratic republic with a deliberative council, mechanisms for resolving disputes, and clear principles of governance. Some historians have argued, and there is genuine evidence to support this, that the Iroquois Confederacy directly influenced some of the ideas that would later appear in the United States Constitution. Whether you accept that argument fully or partially, the point stands. There was already democracy on this continent before the Europeans arrived. In the southwest, the ancestral Puebloans had been building extraordinary structures for centuries. Their cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde in what is now Colorado were architectural achievements of remarkable ingenuity. Communities carved directly into canyon walls, organized around shared spaces, sustained by careful management of scarce water. By the time Europeans reached the southwest, the great classical period of ancestral Puebloan civilization had already passed, but the peoples descended from them, the Hopi, the Zuni, the various Pueblo nations, remained on their land, as they do to this day. In the Mississippi Valley, the city of Cahokia had been, at its peak around the year 1100, one of the largest cities anywhere on Earth. Covering an area larger than contemporary London, Cahokia housed tens of thousands of people, organized around a central plaza dominated by a massive earthen mound that still stands today outside of St. Louis, Missouri. And yes, I realize St. Louis is in Missouri, which is not one of the original 13 colonies. We are not there yet. Patience. The Eastern Woodlands, the region that would eventually become the colonial heartland, were home to dozens of distinct nations. The Powhatan Confederacy dominated the Chesapeake region. The Wampanoag lived along the coast of present-day Massachusetts. The Cherokee inhabited the southern Appalachians. The Delaware, the Shawnee, the Lenape, and many others occupied the lands between. These were not identical cultures. They spoke different languages, practiced different forms of governance, held different spiritual beliefs, and had different relationships with the land. What they shared was a deep familiarity with the continent itself, its rivers, its seasons, its animals, its rhythms. They were at home here in the truest possible sense of that word. When European colonizers later wrote about an empty wilderness waiting to be tamed, they were not describing reality. They were constructing a fiction. The land was not empty, it was full, it was managed. Forests were shaped by controlled burning, coastlines were maintained by careful harvesting. Trails that European explorers marveled at for their efficiency through dense forest were ancient roads, maintained by generations of use. The land that settlers would call wilderness was, in many cases, a sophisticated landscape created by human hands over millennia. This matters, and not just for moral reasons, though it certainly matters for moral reasons. It matters for understanding how colonization actually worked. The Europeans who arrived did not land on blank space. They arrived into existing political, economic, and social systems. They had to negotiate with those systems, fight them, trade with them, sometimes borrow from them, sometimes be saved by them. The history of America's founding is not a story of Europeans creating something from nothing. It is a story of collision, catastrophe, and complicated interaction between many different peoples. Disease changed everything, and this is one of those historical facts that is almost impossible to fully absorb because the scale is so large it becomes abstract. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, the indigenous populations had no immunity to Old World diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza, or typhus. The results were devastating beyond any easy description. Estimates vary, but many historians believe that between 50 and 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died within a century of first contact. Not from warfare alone, though there was plenty of warfare, primarily from disease. In some regions, entire nations effectively ceased to exist before European settlers even arrived in large numbers. When English colonists later described the northeastern coastline as conveniently emptied of its inhabitants, they were not describing a land that had always been sparse. They were looking at the aftermath of a biological catastrophe. The villages were empty because their inhabitants had recently died. The cleared fields were cleared because indigenous farmers had been working them before disease swept through. Understanding this context does not diminish the achievements of the colonists who came later, but it is essential for understanding what America actually is. A place built on the remnants of one civilization by the ambitions of another, shaped by the forced labor of a third. That complexity is not a footnote to American history. It is the foundation. So as we begin this long journey toward independence, toward the Declaration, toward July 4th, 1776, hold in your mind the image of a continent already alive, already ancient, already inhabited. The revolution that created the United States was remarkable, but it happened on land with a story much older than itself. The Americas were not a beginning, they were a continuation. What the Europeans called discovery was, from another perspective, an invasion, and from a third perspective it was the beginning of something genuinely new, a mixture of peoples and ideas and struggles that would eventually produce a nation. None of these perspectives is wrong. They all have to be held together, uncomfortably, simultaneously, to understand what actually happened. That is harder than celebrating fireworks, but it is also more interesting, so let us keep going. The first arrivals and failed beginnings. Europe did not stumble upon the Americas in a single moment of revelation. The process was gradual, messy, and full of false starts, failed settlements, and explorers who sailed into history's footnotes rather than its front pages. If anything, the story of Europe's early relationship with the Americas is less a tale of bold discovery and more a tale of remarkable persistence in the face of repeated humiliating failure, which, depending on your perspective, is either inspiring or deeply alarming. The Norse were first. This is no longer seriously disputed by anyone who has looked at the evidence. Around the year 1000, a Viking explorer named Leif Erikson sailed west from Greenland and reached the shores of North America, landing at a place he called Vinland, which most historians now believe was somewhere in Newfoundland, Canada. The site at Lonceau Meadows in northern Newfoundland has been confirmed through archaeology as a genuine Norse settlement. They built structures. They stayed for a while. They encountered the indigenous peoples of the region, whom the Norse called Skraelings, and that encounter did not go particularly well. The indigenous peoples resisted their presence with a determination that the Norse apparently found persuasive. The colony failed to take root and the Norse went home. Europe would not learn from this initial contact for another 5 centuries. The Norse themselves seem to have filed the whole adventure under interesting but inconclusive and moved on. For those 5 centuries, the Americas existed beyond the edge of European awareness. Fishermen from Bristol and Portugal may have known about the rich fishing grounds of the Grand Banks off Newfoundland and kept the knowledge quietly to themselves, which would be entirely understandable. But no sustained European contact was made, no follow-up expeditions, no colonies, nothing. Then, in 1492, a Genoese navigator sailing under the Spanish crown changed the entire trajectory of world history. Christopher Columbus was not looking for a new world. He was looking for a faster route to Asia, specifically to the spice-producing regions of the East Indies. He had calculated, incorrectly as it turned out, that Asia lay only a few thousand miles west of the Canary Islands. His math was wrong in a way that would have been fatal if the Americas had not inconveniently existed between Europe and Asia. Columbus was, in a sense, saved by a continent he did not know was there. What he found instead of Asia was the Caribbean, and what followed from that contact was one of the most consequential series of events in human history. The encounter between European civilization and the civilizations of the Americas set in motion waves of conquest, colonization, disease, forced migration, and transformation that reshaped the entire world. Columbus himself never fully accepted that he had found something other than Asia. He died insisting he had reached the Indies, which is why the Caribbean islands are still called the West Indies today, a tribute to the stubbornness of one man's geographical conviction. But Columbus never made it to North America proper, and the territory that would eventually become the United States remained outside European colonization for another century or so after his voyages. Spain, which had sponsored Columbus, turned its attention and its astonishing military energy southward toward Mexico, Central America, and the immensely rich civilizations of the Aztec and Inca empires. There was gold there, mountains of it effectively. Why bother with the unknown north? Spain was nonetheless the first European power to take serious interest in what lay north of the Rio Grande. Spanish explorers pushed into Florida, through the Mississippi Valley, and across the baking southwestern deserts in the 1500s, driven by the hope that somewhere up there another Aztec empire was waiting to be plundered. Juan Ponce de Leon reached Florida in 1513, becoming the first European to set foot on what is now the continental United States. He is famously, though almost certainly incorrectly, associated with the legend of a fountain of youth. There is no evidence he was actually looking for one. This may be one of history's more enduring slanders against a man who was primarily interested in conquest and the extraction of wealth, which is less poetic but more accurate. Hernando de Soto led a brutal 3-year expedition through the American Southeast between 1539 and 1542. His route took him through what are now the states of Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Louisiana, leaving behind him a trail of violence, enslavement, and the devastating epidemics that swept through indigenous communities in his wake. De Soto died on the banks of the Mississippi River in 1542 of fever, which seems in retrospect like reasonable karma, though history does not usually work on principles of reasonable karma. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado marched through the southwest in 1540 to 1542, searching for the mythical 7 cities of Cibola, rumoured cities of gold that indigenous peoples had helpfully described in enough detail to keep the Spanish moving northward. Coronado reached what is now Kansas before concluding that there were no golden cities, only vast plains, magnificent canyons, enormous herds of buffalo, and absolutely no gold whatsoever. He returned to Mexico having covered an extraordinary amount of ground and found nothing that justified the trip from a Spanish financial perspective. These expeditions were not settlement attempts. They were armed reconnaissance missions in search of plunder. When they found none, Spain's interest in the north largely evaporated. Spain already had an empire of staggering wealth in Mexico, Central America, and South America. The rough, sparsely settled north was simply not worth the investment. Spain did eventually establish a permanent settlement at Santa Fe in 1608, making it actually older than most of the English colonial settlements on the East Coast. But Spain's North American presence remained thin and peripheral compared to its southern empire. England came to the story late and for a considerable period seemed determined to fail at it as spectacularly as possible. This is said with affection. English persistence in the face of initial catastrophe is one of the more endearing qualities of Elizabethan colonialism. The English claim to North America rested on the voyages of John Cabot, an Italian navigator who sailed under the English flag in 1497 and reached the northeastern coast of North America, probably somewhere in Newfoundland or Labrador. This gave England a theoretical claim to the territory, which it did essentially nothing with for the better part of a century. English attention during the 1500s was largely consumed by the upheavals of the Protestant Reformation, the religious violence of Henry VIII's various theological reinventions, the short reigns of Edward VI and the Catholic Mary I, and then the long, complicated, fascinating reign of Elizabeth I. There was also the ongoing matter of wars with Spain and France, and the generally demanding nature of 16th century European politics. North America simply did not make the priority list. It was not until the later years of Elizabeth's reign that serious English interest in American colonization began to develop, driven by a combination of entrepreneurial ambition, national rivalry with Spain, and the theoretical writings of men like Richard Hakluyt, who argued enthusiastically for colonization's economic and strategic benefits, primarily from the safety of an armchair in London. And even then, the first attempts were disasters of a particularly discouraging kind. Sir Humphrey Gilbert tried to establish a colony in Newfoundland in 1583. The colony collapsed almost immediately. Gilbert himself drowned on the return voyage to England when his small ship was caught in a North Atlantic storm. According to accounts, he was last seen sitting on the deck of his sinking vessel, reading a book and shouting that they were as near to heaven by sea as by land. This is either remarkably philosophical or a sign that the situation had become so bad that equanimity was the only remaining option. His half-brother, Sir Walter Raleigh, tried next, because apparently the family felt that drowning was a Gilbert problem rather than an American colonization problem. Raleigh organised an expedition to a region he named Virginia, in honour of Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, and in 1585 a group of English colonists established themselves on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina. The Roanoke colony failed within a year due to food shortages and severely deteriorating relations with the local Secatan people. The colonists were rescued and brought home by Sir Francis Drake, who happened to be passing through the area while returning from a Caribbean raiding expedition. Drake is a genuinely interesting figure in this period. He was simultaneously a great national hero in England, celebrated for circumnavigating the globe, and a pirate and war criminal from the Spanish perspective, who had spent years plundering Spanish shipping and settlements. Queen Elizabeth knighted him. King Philip of Spain wanted him executed. History accommodates these contradictions without apparent difficulty. Raleigh tried again in 1587. A second group of colonists arrived at Roanoke, this one including women and children, which suggested either greater confidence in the enterprise or a somewhat different understanding of what they were walking into. Among those who arrived was the first English child born in the Americas, Virginia Dare, daughter of Ananias Dare and Eleanor White Dare, and granddaughter of the colony's governor John White. Then something remarkable and deeply mysterious happened. White sailed back to England for supplies and could not return for 3 years, primarily because the Spanish Armada sailed up the English Channel in 1588 and consumed everyone's attention for a while. When White finally made it back to Roanoke in 1590, the colony was gone. Not destroyed. Gone. Every settler had vanished. There was no sign of violence or massacre. The buildings had been carefully dismantled, not burned or broken. The only clue was a single word carved into a wooden post at the fort's entrance. Croatone, the name of a nearby island and the people who lived there. No definitive explanation has ever been found. Historians and archaeologists have been arguing about it for over 4 centuries. The most plausible theory, supported by some archaeological and documentary evidence, is that the colonists integrated themselves into neighbouring indigenous communities to survive, which under the circumstances would have been entirely rational. A less plausible but more entertaining theory involves various kinds of supernatural intervention, which the evidence does not support. The lost colony of Roanoke became one of American history's most enduring mysteries, and it remains one today. What is certain is that when White arrived in 1590, the people he had brought to the New World were nowhere to be found, and he spent the rest of his life unable to learn what had become of them, including his daughter and granddaughter. The lesson that cautious, reasonable observers might have drawn from all of this accumulated evidence was obvious. Establishing a permanent English colony in North America was extraordinarily difficult, dangerous, expensive, and perhaps not worth attempting again given the track record. The lesson that investors, adventurers, and ambitious Elizabethans actually drew was somewhat different. They concluded that previous attempts had simply lacked sufficient planning, sufficient resources, and a sufficiently commercial approach. What was needed was not fewer attempts but better organised ones. Not individual patrons funding expeditions out of personal ambition, but joint stock companies pooling capital from multiple investors, spreading the risk, and approaching colonization as a business venture rather than an adventure. This conclusion would lead, within a decade, to a new attempt at a permanent English settlement in North America, one that would survive its early catastrophes by the thinnest of margins, one that would establish the English presence on the American continent in a way that all previous attempts had failed to do, one that would eventually, through a long chain of consequences no one in 1607 could have predicted, help produce a revolution and a nation. Which brings us to Jamestown. Jamestown and the fragile foothold. In the spring of 1607, 3 ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed and the Discovery, arrived in the Chesapeake Bay after a long and difficult Atlantic crossing. They carried roughly 104 colonists, primarily men and boys, sent by the Virginia Company of London, a joint stock company that had obtained a royal charter from King James I to establish an English colony in Virginia. The colonists dropped anchor in the James River and began building what would become Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in North America. It is important to understand exactly what kind of enterprise this was. The Virginia Company was not a charitable organization or a government program, it was a business. Its investors expected a return. The colonists were sent to find gold, to find a route to the Pacific, and to establish a trade settlement that would generate profit. They were not, for the most part, farmers or craftsmen. Many were gentlemen, which in the English class system of the early 1600s meant men who were accustomed to having other people do physical labour for them. Sending gentlemen to establish an agricultural colony was, to put it gently, not an ideal plan. The site they chose for the settlement was strategically reasonable. It was far enough upriver to be defensible from Spanish ships. It had a deep harbour suitable for large vessels. But it was also a swampy, mosquito-infested peninsula with brackish water, terrible soil, and summer heat that the English were entirely unprepared for, and it sat within the territory of the Powhatan Confederacy, a powerful alliance of approximately 30 Algonquian-speaking tribes led by a paramount chief named Wahun Seneca, whom the English called Powhatan. The relationship between the Jamestown colonists and the Powhatan Confederacy was one of the most complicated and consequential relationships in early American history. The Powhatan people were not simply obstacles to English expansion. They were sophisticated political actors responding to the arrival of a new and unpredictable foreign presence in their territory. Wahun Seneca initially adopted a cautious strategy of engagement. He allowed trade to develop. He sent food to the starving colonists during the early years. He may have calculated that the English could be useful allies, or that they could be absorbed and controlled. The colonists, for their part, were desperately dependent on Powhatan trade goods to survive. The famous story of John Smith and Pocahontas, which has been so thoroughly romanticized by popular culture that it barely resembles the historical reality, involves a moment in 1607 when Smith was captured by Powhatan warriors and brought before Wahun Seneca. Whether what followed was an actual near execution or a ritual ceremony of adoption, as many historians now believe, what emerged from the encounter was a working relationship between Smith and Wahun Seneca that helped keep the colony alive. But the colony very nearly died anyway. The first years at Jamestown were a prolonged catastrophe. The summer heat killed people. The brackish water made people ill. Disease, particularly typhoid and dysentery, swept through the settlement. Food supplies ran out. Relations with the Powhatan deteriorated as English demands became more aggressive and the colonists' behaviour more erratic. By the winter of 1609 to 1610, a period known as the Starving Time, the situation had become so desperate that the surviving colonists, reduced from several hundred people to perhaps 60, were reduced to eating horses, dogs, rats, shoes, and, according to some accounts that are supported by archaeological evidence, one another. The winter of 1609 was not a good time to be in Jamestown. Rescue came in the spring of 1610, when a resupply fleet arrived from England. The surviving colonists were literally boarding ships to abandon the colony when the resupply arrived. They turned around and went back to land. That is how close Jamestown came to joining Roanoke on the list of failed English colonial attempts. What saved Jamestown in the long run was tobacco. John Rolfe, a colonist who is also famous for marrying Pocahontas in 1614, a political marriage that helped stabilize relations with the Powhatan for several years, experimented with cultivating a variety of tobacco that appealed to European tastes. The first shipment of Virginia tobacco reached England in 1614 and was immediately popular. Tobacco was the colony's salvation, and it was also, in retrospect, the beginning of several catastrophic developments. Tobacco farming required enormous amounts of land and enormous amounts of labour. The demand for land drove the Virginia colonists into increasingly aggressive expansion into Powhatan territory. The demand for labour eventually drove the development of African chattel slavery in North America. Tobacco was not just a crop. It was the engine of a particular kind of colonial society, one built on the exploitation of both land and people. The Powhatan Confederacy fought back. In 1622, a coordinated attack led by Wahun Seneca's brother and successor, Opeshansano, killed roughly 400 colonists about a third of the English population of Virginia at the time. The attack shocked England and hardened colonial attitudes toward indigenous peoples, transforming the relationship from uneasy coexistence to outright conquest. A second major Powhatan attack in 1644 was similarly devastating, but ultimately failed to dislodge the now much larger English presence. Upchansano, who was nearly 100 years old and reportedly so frail he had to be carried into battle, was captured and later murdered in captivity by a colonial guard. By the middle of the 17th century, Virginia had been transformed. The Powhatan Confederacy had been broken, tobacco plantations spread across the colony, and a system of indentured servitude in which English men and women worked for a term of years in exchange for their passage to the New World provided the initial labour force. This system would be supplemented and eventually largely replaced by African slavery, with consequences that would shape American history for centuries. Jamestown itself was eventually abandoned as a centre of colonial government, replaced by Williamsburg in 1699, but its significance was permanent. It had demonstrated that English colonisation of North America was possible, and in demonstrating that, it set in motion everything that followed. The Pilgrims, the Puritans, and New England. While Virginia was learning how to grow tobacco and survive in the Chesapeake, a very different kind of English colonial project was taking shape far to the north. This one was driven not by profit, primarily, but by religion, or at least that is the story most Americans learn. The reality, as usual, is more complicated. The Pilgrims who boarded the Mayflower in 1620 were separatists, a radical branch of English Protestantism that believed the Church of England was so corrupt that it could not be reformed from within and must be separated from entirely. This was a dangerous position in early 17th century England. The separatists had already been persecuted, some imprisoned. A group of them had fled to the Netherlands, where they lived for a decade before deciding that Dutch society, while tolerant, was drawing their children away from their faith and their English identity. The decision to cross the Atlantic was not made lightly. The Pilgrims had heard about Jamestown. They knew what life in the American wilderness was like. But their religious conviction was stronger than their fear, which is saying something, because the crossing of the North Atlantic in the early 17th century on a small wooden ship was genuinely terrifying. The Mayflower departed Plymouth, England in September 1620 with 102 passengers. The crossing took 66 days. It was cold, wet, cramped, and dangerous. Passengers were confined to a low-ceilinged between-deck space that was essentially a converted cargo hold. They could not go above deck during storms. They ate mostly salt provisions and drank beer, which was safer than water on long voyages. One passenger died during the crossing. One baby was born and named, with a commitment to brand identity that one has to admire, Oceanus. They had intended to land in Virginia, but wind and currents pushed them north. They made landfall in November 1620 at what is now Provincetown on Cape Cod, in territory that was not covered by their Virginia Company charter. Before going ashore, they drew up the Mayflower Compact, a brief document in which the male passengers agreed to form a self-governing body and to create laws for the general good of the colony. This document, modest though it was, represented something genuinely important. Government by consent of the governed was not a theoretical idea for these people. It was a practical necessity. They spent several weeks exploring Cape Cod by small boat, before choosing a site across the bay for their settlement. They called it Plymouth, after the English port they had sailed from. When they arrived at Plymouth in December 1620, they found cleared land and a recently emptied village. They did not know this at the time, but the village had been emptied by the epidemic of 1617 to 1619, which had killed the vast majority of the Wampanoag people in the region. The Pilgrims interpreted the cleared land and empty village as providential. God had prepared a place for them. They did not ask why the land was empty. The first winter at Plymouth was horrific. Nearly half of the colonists died from cold, disease, and malnutrition. By spring, only about 50 of the original 102 settlers remained alive. What followed is the story that Americans learn in elementary school, and while the traditional Thanksgiving narrative smooths over an enormous amount of complexity, the core of it is true. A Wampanoag man named Squanto, whose full name was Tisquantum, was already present in the region and spoke English, having been kidnapped by English traders and taken to Europe before managing to return to North America. His assistance to the Plymouth colonists in teaching them to plant corn and navigate the local landscape was genuinely important to their survival. A broader alliance between the Plymouth colonists and the Wampanoag Sachem Massasoit was established in 1621 and held for 50 years, longer than most diplomatic agreements of any era manage. The harvest celebration of 1621, which is the origin of the Thanksgiving story, was a real event. It was a 3-day feast attended by colonists and Wampanoag guests, centered on the harvest and including games, military exercises, and, as the historical record mentions, a great deal of waterfowl. Whether turkey specifically was on the menu is uncertain, but waterfowl certainly was. The Puritan migration that followed was a different matter in scale, if not in spirit. The Puritans differed from the separatists in that they believed the Church of England could be reformed from within. But by the 1620s and 1630s, with Charles I on the throne and Archbishop Laud aggressively enforcing conformity, the Puritans' position in England was becoming increasingly untenable. Between 1630 and 1640, approximately 20,000 Puritans crossed to New England in what historians call the Great Migration. John Winthrop, the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, articulated the vision that animated this migration in a sermon delivered aboard the ship Arbella in 1630. He told his fellow colonists that they would be as a city upon a hill, watched by the eyes of all people. This phrase, borrowed from the Gospel of Matthew, has echoed through American political rhetoric ever since, invoked by everyone from John F. Kennedy to Ronald Reagan. Winthrop's original meaning was specifically Puritan and specifically religious. He was not describing a beacon of freedom and democracy. He was describing a godly community that would demonstrate proper Christian governance to the watching world. The Puritan vision was not what modern Americans would recognize as tolerant or pluralistic. Dissenters were expelled. Roger Williams, who argued that civil authorities had no right to enforce religious observance and that the colonial charters had no validity because the land had not been properly purchased from indigenous peoples, was banished from Massachusetts in 1636. He founded Providence in what would become Rhode Island, establishing a colony that genuinely separated church and state and offered religious tolerance. Anne Hutchinson, who held theological discussions in her home and challenged clerical authority, was tried and banished in 1637. She eventually settled in what is now New York and was killed in an indigenous raid in 1643. But for all its rigidities, New England Puritanism also created something durable. The Puritans believed deeply in literacy. You had to be able to read the Bible to understand God's will. New England had high literacy rates compared to the rest of the colonial world. They founded Harvard College in 1636, only 6 years after arriving in Massachusetts. They created town meeting government, a system of direct local democracy that shaped New England political culture for centuries. They built communities with the deliberate intention of lasting, and last they did. 13 colonies taking shape. Between the founding of Virginia in 1607 and the establishment of Georgia in 1732, England planted 13 distinct colonies along the eastern seaboard of North America. They were not planned as a unit. Nobody sat down in London with a map and a cup of tea and said, "Right, we shall have 13 colonies arranged just so, and they will eventually become a great nation." It happened gradually, opportunistically and often chaotically, driven by a mixture of religious conviction, commercial ambition, royal favoritism, and the sheer human tendency to keep moving west until something stops you. The colonies grew up separately, with different origins, different economies, different religious cultures, and different relationships to the crown. They did not think of themselves as a single entity. A merchant in Boston had more in common with a merchant in London in many respects than with a tobacco planter in Virginia. A rice planter in South Carolina inhabited a social world almost entirely unlike that of a Quaker farmer in Pennsylvania, and yet by the mid-18th century they had developed enough shared identity, shared grievances and shared interests to act, when pushed hard enough, as something resembling a single people. That transformation, from 13 separate and rather suspicious neighbours into something that could function collectively, is one of the more remarkable political developments of the era. Understanding how it happened requires first understanding how different the colonies actually were, because this was genuinely not one colonial society. It was several, living in proximity and occasional irritation with one another. New England, consisting of Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, was the most culturally cohesive of the colonial regions, built on the foundations of Puritan settlement and shaped by nearly a century and a half of the Puritan legacy. Its economy rested on fishing, shipbuilding, trade, and small-scale farming. Its social structure was relatively egalitarian by the standards of the time, which is a phrase that requires immediate qualification, because it still excluded women, the poor, and the enslaved from political participation. So egalitarian is doing considerable work there. But compared to the aristocratic hierarchies of England and the plantation societies of the South, New England's towns had a genuine quality of broad participation in local life. The town meeting, in particular, was an institution unlike almost anything in the contemporary English-speaking world. Eligible voters in a New England town gathered in the meeting house to debate local affairs, elect officers, set tax rates, and manage the community's business directly. It was a form of democracy limited in its reach, but vigorous in its practice, and the habits of argument, deliberation, and collective decision-making it created were deeply embedded in New England's political culture. When the revolutionary crisis came, those habits would matter enormously. The middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, were the most ethnically and religiously diverse of the colonial regions, and in some ways the most interesting precisely because of that diversity. New York had been Dutch before the English seized it in 1664, renaming it after the Duke of York. It retained a Dutch flavour for generations in its architecture, its family names along the Hudson River, and its somewhat more relaxed attitude toward commercial life than Puritan New England. Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn, a Quaker, in 1681 as a refuge for religious minorities of all kinds. Penn's frame of government offered remarkable religious tolerance for its time, and people took him up on it enthusiastically. German immigrants arrived in large numbers. Scots-Irish settlers moved through Pennsylvania and down into the back country. Swedish communities had been there even before the English. Welsh Quakers, French Huguenots, and English religious dissenters of every variety found their way to the middle colonies. The result was a patchwork of communities speaking different languages, practicing different faiths, and coexisting in a manner that was sometimes harmonious and sometimes contentious, but always, at minimum, interesting. The middle colonies' economies reflected their diversity. Farming was mixed rather than dominated by a single crop. Trade was active. Artisan manufacturing was more developed here than in New England or the South. Philadelphia, founded by Penn in 1682 on the western bank of the Delaware River, grew with extraordinary speed to become by the mid-18th century the largest and most cosmopolitan city in British North America. Its grid of streets, its busy wharves, its coffee houses and taverns and printing shops, its blend of peoples and ideas made it the natural centre of colonial intellectual and political life. When the time came to hold a Continental Congress, there was really no other city that made sense. The Chesapeake colonies of Virginia and Maryland were defined by a single word: tobacco. Maryland had been founded in 1632 as a proprietary colony granted to the Calvert family, originally envisioned as a refuge for English Catholics in a Protestant-dominated world, though it quickly became religiously mixed in practice. Both Virginia and Maryland developed plantation economies that relied first on indentured servants, English men and women who worked for a term of years in exchange for their passage, and then increasingly, as the 17th century progressed, on enslaved African labour. The transition from indentured servitude to chattel slavery was not inevitable, but it was economically driven, and once made it reshaped everything about Chesapeake society. The social structure that emerged was more sharply hierarchical than anything in New England. A small planter elite dominated political life, sat in colonial assemblies, served as local magistrates, and organized their world around the management of large land holdings worked by people they owned. The great planters of Virginia were extraordinarily wealthy by colonial standards and deeply conscious of their status. They modelled themselves, somewhat self-consciously, on the English landed gentry. They read widely, built elegant houses, and participated in a cultural life that aspired to gentility, even at a considerable remove from London. The lower South, the Carolinas and Georgia, would develop yet another variant of the colonial model, one that pushed the logic of plantation agriculture further than anywhere else on the continent. South Carolina in particular developed an economy based initially on rice and then on indigo, crops whose cultivation required enormous quantities of labour in conditions of brutal heat and disease exposure. The solution the planters chose was enslaved African labour on a scale that exceeded even the Chesapeake colonies. The demographics of coastal South Carolina by the mid-18th century were by any measure extraordinary. Enslaved black people did not merely constitute a large minority. They outnumbered free white colonists by significant margins in many areas, sometimes by 2 to 1 or more. This demographic reality shaped everything about the colony's political culture. It generated particular and persistent anxieties about slave rebellion, which were not paranoid fantasies, but responses to a genuine social tension that everyone, enslaved and free, lived with daily. It generated particular insistence on the absolute protection of slavery as a political and economic institution. And it produced a planter class whose wealth, confidence and belligerence on the subject of their perceived rights would make them formidable participants in the coming revolutionary drama. Georgia was the last of the 13, and in some respects the strangest. Founded in 1732 by a group of philanthropically minded trustees led by James Oglethorpe, it was conceived as a social experiment as much as a commercial venture. Oglethorpe and his colleagues wanted to create a colony for England's worthy poor, people imprisoned for debt or simply struggling, who would be given a fresh start in the new world as small independent farmers. There would be no slavery and no large land holdings. The colony would be a model of orderly, modest republican virtue. It is one of history's more pointed ironies that Georgia, founded explicitly on anti-slavery principles by idealistic reformers, would become by the 19th century one of the most aggressively and vehemently pro-slavery states in the entire Union. The trustees' noble experiment lasted approximately 20 years before the colonists, looking at the wealthy slave-worked plantations in neighbouring South Carolina and doing their own financial calculations, successfully lobbied to be allowed to hold enslaved people and accumulate large tracts of land. The idealism collapsed under the weight of economic incentive with a speed that should perhaps surprise no one who has paid attention to how economic incentives tend to operate. What connected these very different colonial societies, despite all their differences, was a shared experience of being British subjects at a distance from the mother country. The Atlantic Ocean was not just a physical barrier, it was a psychological one. People who crossed it and stayed were changed by the crossing in ways they did not always recognise or articulate. They were, whether they meant to be or not, setting themselves apart from the world they had left behind. They were building something new even in those moments when they believed most sincerely that they were simply replicating something old. Every colony also had a frontier, a western edge that was, throughout the 17th and into the 18th century, a place of danger, possibility, encounter with indigenous peoples, and the constant reminder that the colonial world was neither settled nor permanent. The frontier demanded practical competence, local decision-making, and direct action. It created people who were accustomed to dealing with problems without waiting for instructions from a distant authority. That disposition, too, would have consequences. The colonial assemblies were the political institution that tied everything together. Every colony had developed some form of representative body through which local men of property participated in governance. In theory, these assemblies operated under the authority of royal governors, or in proprietary colonies, the owners. In practice, they had acquired over the course of the 17th century substantial real power, primarily because they controlled the local purse strings. A governor who could not persuade the assembly to fund his programs was a governor without much practical authority. The Virginia House of Burgesses, established in 1619, was the oldest elected legislative body in the Americas. The Massachusetts General Court had been a genuine centre of power since the 1630s. These were not democracies in the modern sense, and it is important to be clear about that. They were elected by property-owning white men, a fraction of the total population. Women had no vote. Enslaved people had no vote. Poor men without property had no vote. But they were real representative bodies with genuine power, and the men who served in them had developed, over generations, an extraordinarily strong conviction that the right to participate in their own governance was not a privilege but a birthright. That conviction was the cultural inheritance that made the revolution possible. The colonists who would eventually resist parliamentary taxation were not inventing a new political theory from scratch. They were defending a practice they had been living for a century and a half. They had been governing themselves. They knew what it felt like, and they were not, when it came to it, willing to give it up. The Atlantic world, trade, slavery, and empire. No account of the road to American independence can be honest without confronting the institution that stood at the centre of the colonial economy and at the heart of the nation's founding contradiction, slavery. The first Africans arrived in English Virginia in 1619, the same year as the first meeting of the Virginia House of Burgesses. It is a coincidence of dates that says something significant about the dual nature of what was being built. Democratic self-governance and chattel slavery arrived in North America at almost exactly the same moment. Those first Africans in Virginia occupied an ambiguous legal status. Some were treated similarly to indentured servants, working for a term of years and then gaining freedom. At least one, Anthony Johnson, eventually became a free property owner himself. But this ambiguity did not last. Over the course of the 17th century, Virginia and other colonies passed increasingly explicit laws defining slavery as a permanent hereditary status based on race. By 1662, Virginia had codified that the status of a child followed the status of the mother, meaning that children born to enslaved women were themselves enslaved regardless of who their father was. By 1675, African descent itself was becoming legally synonymous with slavery. This legal transformation was driven by economics. Tobacco, rice, and indigo plantations needed labour, lots of it. The supply of indentured servants from England was unpredictable and eventually declining. Enslaved Africans, who could be held permanently and whose children could also be enslaved, represented a more reliable and, from the planters' perspective, more economical labour force. The brutality of the decision to build the colonial economy on chattel slavery was not incidental. It was deliberate. The transatlantic slave trade that supplied this labour was one of the largest forced migrations in human history. Over the 4 centuries during which it operated, the trade transported approximately 12.5 million Africans across the Atlantic. Perhaps 2 million died during the crossing, the infamous Middle Passage, from disease, violence, and the sheer horrifying conditions of the voyage. The ships were designed to maximize human cargo. Enslaved people were chained in spaces so tight that they could barely move, forced to lie in their own waste for weeks, surrounded by the dying and the dead. The triangular trade that structured the Atlantic economy linked Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a system of devastating efficiency. European goods were traded in Africa for enslaved people. Enslaved people were transported to the Americas. American commodities produced by enslaved labour, tobacco, rice, sugar, cotton, were shipped to Europe. Everyone in this system made money except the people who made it run. By the mid-18th century, approximately 400,000 enslaved people lived in the British mainland colonies. They were concentrated in the Chesapeake and Lower South, where plantation agriculture demanded the most labour, but there were enslaved people in every colony, including the supposedly more enlightened North, where they worked in households, on farms, and in maritime trades. The existence of slavery in a society that was increasingly talking about natural rights and human freedom created a tension that some colonists felt acutely, and many managed not to feel at all. Quakers were among the earliest and most consistent opponents of slavery in the colonial world. Anthony Benezet in Philadelphia was publishing anti-slavery tracts in the 1760s. John Woolman travelled the colonies urging Quakers to free their enslaved workers. But these were minority voices. For most of the planter elite who would lead the revolution, the contradiction between their rhetoric about liberty and their practice of slavery was managed through elaborate rationalization, willful blindness, and the economic incentive not to look too hard at the thing that was making them wealthy. Thomas Jefferson would write that all men are created equal, while owning more than 600 enslaved people over the course of his lifetime. George Washington held enslaved people at Mount Vernon throughout the Revolution and beyond. These are not obscure footnotes to the founding. They are central to understanding what was actually being founded and the unfinished business it left for every subsequent generation. The slavery issue was not resolved at the founding, it was deferred, and the price of that deferral would eventually be paid in the bloodiest war in American history. But that is a later chapter. For now, we note it as the darkness at the heart of the story, present from the beginning, impossible to ignore honestly. The colonial economy was also shaped by trade regulations that would become a major source of grievance. The Navigation Acts, first passed in the 1650s and expanded over subsequent decades, required that colonial trade be conducted on English ships and that many colonial products be sold only to England. The theory was mercantilism, the idea that a colony existed to enrich the mother country. The colonists, especially in New England and the Middle Colonies, chafed under these restrictions. Smuggling was endemic. Customs enforcement was lax and often corrupt. A shadow economy of illegal trade ran alongside the official one. The Atlantic world that produced the American Revolution was not a simple story of freedom versus tyranny. It was a tangled network of interests, dependencies, and contradictions. The colonists who would eventually declare their independence were participants in a global economic system built partly on human bondage. Their cry for freedom was genuine, and it was also, from the perspective of the enslaved, profoundly incomplete. Colonial life. What it actually felt like. History has a way of abstracted people into ideas. The Pilgrims become symbols of religious freedom. The planters become symbols of colonial aristocracy. The founding fathers become marble statues. But they were all, before anything else, people living daily lives that were shaped by the particular textures of colonial existence. So let us slow down for a moment and think about what it actually felt like to live in colonial America. For most colonists, most of the time, life was local. The world beyond one's town or county was distant, reached by bad roads, slow ships, and unreliable post. A farmer in the Connecticut River Valley in 1740 would have had more daily contact with his neighbours, his minister, and the land itself than with anything that could be described as a broader colonial society. The rhythm of life was the rhythm of agriculture, planting, tending, harvesting, putting up for winter, beginning again. Houses were smaller than modern Americans are accustomed to imagining. A typical farmhouse in New England was a two-room structure, perhaps expanded over time as the family prospered, heated by a single large fireplace that was the centre of cooking, warmth, and light. Privacy was a luxury that most colonial households did not have. Children slept several to a bed. Servants or apprentices shared the main room. In winter, the warmth of bodies was as important as the warmth of the fire. Food was seasonal, preserved, and sometimes monotonous. Corn was the staple grain of most colonial diets. Cornmeal made into bread, porridge, or pudding appeared at nearly every meal. Pork was the most common meat, since pigs required less land and care than cattle. Salt pork, dried beans, and root vegetables got most colonial families through the winter. Fresh vegetables and fruits were summer luxuries. Tea became an important part of colonial life, particularly in New England, where by the 1760s and 70s it was consumed at essentially every social occasion. The taxation of tea would eventually become a flashpoint for revolution, which tells you something about how culturally important tea had become. Taverns were the social centres of colonial life in a way that is hard to fully appreciate today. In an era before newspapers were common, before public libraries existed, before any form of mass communication, the tavern was where people gathered, talked, debated, and heard news from travellers passing through. It was also where a great deal of political organising would eventually happen. The tavern was not just a place to drink, it was the public sphere made physical. Religion permeated colonial society in ways that varied dramatically by region. In Puritan New England, the church and the community were effectively the same thing. Sunday services were mandatory. Community standards of behaviour were enforced. The Puritan tradition created what historians have called a culture of covenant, a sense that the community as a whole had a collective responsibility to maintain its relationship with God, which meant monitoring and disciplining the behaviour of individuals. In the southern colonies, the Anglican Church was the established church in theory, though in practice the distances involved meant that many rural colonists lived far from any church and participated irregularly in formal religious life. The Great Awakening of the 1730s and 1740s shook colonial religious life with the force of a theological earthquake. A series of evangelical revivals swept through the colonies, led by preachers like George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, and dozens of local imitators. These preachers spoke of personal conversion, immediate encounter with God, and the reality of hellfire with an emotional intensity that was radically different from the formal, educated Christianity of established churches. The Great Awakening had political implications that were not immediately obvious. It created a new kind of public speaking, passionate, direct, aimed at common people rather than educated elites. It divided congregations, created new denominations, challenged existing church hierarchies, and embedded in a large portion of the colonial population a conviction that religious authority was personal and direct, not mediated through institutions. The habits of mind developed in evangelical religion would later transfer naturally into political dissent. Printing presses had been in the colonies since 1638. By the mid-18th century, colonial newspapers were proliferating rapidly. The Boston Gazette, the Pennsylvania Gazette, edited for many years by Benjamin Franklin, and dozens of other papers were creating a colonial public that shared information and arguments across distances that physical travel could not easily bridge. The newspaper was not yet what it would become in the 19th century, but it was already becoming a crucial instrument of political communication. Education in the colonies ranged from the Harvard-anchored system of New England, which valued literacy and learning as religious and civic obligations, to the largely informal education of the southern frontier, where formal schooling was sporadic and literacy rates lower. But everywhere in the colonies, a process of self-education was operating. People were reading, debating, and thinking about ideas. The Enlightenment, which was reshaping European intellectual life in the 17th and 18th centuries, was reaching colonial drawing rooms and taverns through books, pamphlets, and newspapers. John Locke's ideas about natural rights and the social contract were being discussed in Philadelphia and Boston as earnestly as they were in London. Women's lives in colonial society were circumscribed by law and custom in ways that modern readers find uncomfortable. Married women had essentially no legal existence separate from their husbands. They could not own property, sign contracts, or appear in court in their own right. Their labour in household production, in child rearing, in the management of farms and businesses was essential to the colonial economy, but largely invisible in the official record. Yet within these constraints, colonial women exercised considerable practical power. They managed households that were genuinely productive economic units. They participated in the information networks of their communities. They would play important roles in the Revolutionary period, organising boycotts, making homespun to replace British goods, and managing farms and businesses while their husbands were away at war. The colonial world that produced the American Revolution was not a simple place. It was complex, contradictory, full of hierarchies and exclusions, but it had also produced over more than a century and a half a population that was accustomed to governing itself, capable of organising collectively, skilled at argumentation, and increasingly resentful of external control. These were the ingredients of a revolution. They still needed a match. The French and Indian War. The match was a war, but not the revolution itself. A different war fought a decade and a half before independence, which created the conditions that made independence both thinkable and eventually inevitable. The conflict known in North America as the French and Indian War, and in Europe as the 7 Years' War, was in many ways the first truly global conflict in history. It was fought simultaneously on multiple continents, in the Caribbean, in India, in West Africa, in Europe, and in North America. Britain emerged victorious and found itself, in 1763, in possession of the largest empire the world had yet seen, and therein lay the problem. The origins of the conflict in North America lay in the Ohio River Valley. By the 1740s and early 1750s, both the British and the French were claiming the same territory. The French had a long-established network of forts, trading posts, and alliances with indigenous peoples throughout the interior of the continent. The British colonists, particularly in Virginia, had their own designs on the Ohio Valley, where land speculators, including a company that counted George Washington's family among its investors, had their eyes on the territory. In 1753, the royal governor of Virginia sent a 21-year-old surveyor and militia officer named George Washington to deliver a message to the French commander at Fort Le Boeuf in what is now western Pennsylvania, essentially telling the French to leave. The French declined. Washington returned with the answer and immediately went back the following year with a small military force. What followed was a series of military encounters that resulted in Washington's surrender at Fort Necessity in July 1754. It was, by the standards of his later career, not a great beginning. But it was a beginning. Washington would learn from this experience and from everything that followed. The war expanded rapidly. Britain sent regular army troops under General Edward Braddock in 1755. Braddock's expedition to capture Fort Duquesne, at the forks of the Ohio where Pittsburgh now stands, ended in catastrophic defeat when a French and indigenous force ambushed his column in the Pennsylvania wilderness. Braddock himself was killed. Washington, serving as an aide-de-camp, had 2 horses shot from under him and 4 bullet holes in his coat. He survived and became, at 23, a colonial hero. The early years of the war went badly for Britain. The French and their indigenous allies were more effective at wilderness warfare than the British regulars, who were trained for European-style battles fought in open fields. Fort after fort fell. The colonial militia proved unreliable. British commanders were often contemptuous of colonial soldiers, and colonial cooperation was sporadic. The turning point came after William Pitt the Elder became the driving force of British war policy. Pitt was a brilliant strategist who understood that the key to the war was not just fighting on multiple fronts, but fighting smart on each front. He poured resources into North America, replaced ineffective commanders, and for the first time treated the colonial assemblies as genuine partners, rather than subordinate bodies to be ordered around. He promised to reimburse the colonies for their military expenses, which significantly improved colonial cooperation. The results were dramatic. In 1759, often called the Year of Miracles, British forces captured Quebec, the heart of French Canada, in a dramatic battle on the Plains of Abraham in which both the British commander, James Wolfe, and the French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, were killed. Montreal fell the following year. By 1763, when the Treaty of Paris ended the war, France had been almost entirely expelled from North America. Britain gained Canada and all French territory east of the Mississippi. For the American colonies, the war had profound consequences. Practically, the removal of the French threat from Canada meant that the colonists no longer needed British military protection in the way they once had. The primary external danger to colonial life had been eliminated. This made British military presence in the colonies feel less like protection and more like occupation. Culturally, the war had produced a generation of colonial officers and soldiers who had served alongside British regulars and come away unimpressed. British officers had treated colonial soldiers as socially inferior, had dismissed their methods, and had, at Braddock's disaster, led them to slaughter through their own rigid arrogance. The experience did not generate admiration or deference. It generated resentment and a conviction that colonial soldiers were at least the equal of their British counterparts. And then there was the debt. Britain had spent an enormous amount of money fighting this war. The national debt had nearly doubled. The new territories acquired by the war needed to be administered, defended, and governed. All of this cost money, and someone had to pay for it. The British government's answer to this question would light the fuse. Taxation without representation. The new British Prime Minister George Grenville looked at the situation in 1763 and saw it as straightforward. Britain had just spent an enormous amount fighting a war that had, among other things, benefited its American colonies enormously. The colonies were prosperous. They were lightly taxed compared to people in Britain. It seemed entirely reasonable to Grenville and to a large portion of the British political establishment that the colonies should contribute to their own defence and to the cost of the empire that protected them. The colonists saw it very differently. The first significant act of the new policy was actually not a tax. It was the Proclamation of 1763, issued in the immediate aftermath of the war, which prohibited colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. The British government intended this as a temporary measure to prevent conflict with indigenous peoples, while a longer-term policy was developed. The colonists interpreted it as an attempt to deny them access to the western lands they had just helped win. This was followed in 1765 by the Stamp Act, the first direct tax Parliament had ever imposed on the colonies. The Act required that a wide range of printed materials, legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, and even playing cards carry a tax stamp. The revenue was to go toward paying for the British military presence in North America. The colonial reaction was explosive and almost immediately organised. The Stamp Act Congress, held in New York in October 1765, brought together representatives from 9 colonies, the most significant intercolonial meeting yet held. They produced a Declaration of Rights and Grievances asserting that Parliament had no right to tax the colonies because the colonies were not represented in Parliament. This was the argument that would define the entire pre-revolutionary period. Taxation without representation is tyranny. It was not a new argument. The principle that Englishmen could only be taxed by their own representatives went back to Magna Carta in 1215. What the colonists were arguing was that they were Englishmen, and that they deserved the rights of Englishmen, including this fundamental constitutional right. Parliament's response to the taxation without representation argument was to invoke the doctrine of virtual representation, the idea that every member of Parliament represented not just his constituents, but all British subjects everywhere, including the colonies. The colonists found this argument unconvincing and somewhat insulting. Their position was that actual representation, by people they actually elected who were actually accountable to them, was what the English constitution required. Beyond the constitutional argument, there was also a practical organisation of resistance that was rapid, effective, and somewhat surprising in its sophistication. Merchants in colonial cities organised non-importation agreements, refusing to import British goods until the Stamp Act was repealed. Since the colonies were an important market for British manufactured goods, this put genuine economic pressure on British merchants who then lobbied Parliament. Sons of Liberty organisations sprang up in cities across the colonies, organising popular resistance, intimidating stamp collectors into resigning their positions, and ensuring that the act could not actually be enforced. In several cities, the houses of stamp collectors and other officials were attacked by crowds. These were not random acts of violence. They were organised demonstrations intended to make enforcement of the act impossible. Stamp distributors in colony after colony resigned or were forced to resign before the act even went into effect. On the day it was supposed to take effect, November 1st, 1765, it was essentially a dead letter. No one was selling stamps because no one would do the selling. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. The colonists celebrated, and then Parliament, apparently constitutionally incapable of learning from experience, immediately passed the Declaratory Act, asserting that Parliament had the right to tax and legislate for the colonies, in all cases whatsoever. The repeal meant nothing, Parliament was saying. We still have the power. We are just choosing not to use it right now. The Townshend Acts of 1767 pushed the issue further. These acts imposed import duties on a range of goods including glass, paper, lead, paint and tea. Charles Townshend, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer who proposed them, apparently believed that since the colonists objected to internal taxes, import duties levied at the port would be more acceptable. He was wrong. The colonists objected to any taxation by a parliament in which they had no representation, and the Townshend Acts provoked a new round of organised resistance. Non-importation agreements were organised again. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania published his letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, laying out the constitutional case against parliamentary taxation in clear, accessible prose that circulated widely through colonial newspapers. The Massachusetts Circular Letter, drafted by Samuel Adams, urged all the colonial assemblies to unite in resistance. Britain's response was to send troops to Boston in 1768. This was, in political terms, a spectacular miscalculation. Nothing demonstrated the gap between British intentions and colonial perceptions more clearly than stationing soldiers in a colonial city to enforce tax collection. To the colonists, it looked like military occupation. To British officials, it looked like routine maintenance of order. Both were, in their own terms, right. And that mutual incomprehension was moving the two sides steadily toward violence. Sons of liberty and the streets begin to boil. If you want to understand how a collection of 13 separate colonies, with different economies, different religions, different social structures, and no shared government, managed to organise a coordinated revolution, you have to understand the political machinery that was built during the decade before independence. And at the centre of that machinery was a man who was, depending on who you ask, either the indispensable architect of American liberty or the most effective political agitator the 18th century produced. His name was Samuel Adams, and he was genuinely impressive. Adams was a Boston politician, a failed businessman, and a remarkably skilled organiser. He understood something that his cousin John Adams, who was more intellectually distinguished, initially did not: that revolutions are not made by arguments alone. They are made by organisations, by the cultivation of popular anger, and by the creation of shared narratives that turn abstract grievances into personal offences. Adams was a master at all three. He built the Sons of Liberty network in Massachusetts into an effective political organisation that could mobilise crowds, organise boycotts, control information, and coordinate with similar organisations in other colonies. He wrote prolifically for colonial newspapers under various pen names, and his writing had a quality that distinguished it from most political writing of the era. It was readable. It was direct. It spoke in terms that ordinary people could understand and respond to. He was also, and I say this with a certain affection for the complexity it represents, not above manipulating events to achieve his political goals. When the truth about a given incident was ambiguous, Adams had a tendency to present the version most useful for the cause of colonial resistance. He was, in the modern parlance, an excellent spin doctor. The event that gave Adams his greatest spin opportunity came on the night of March 5, 1770, on King Street in Boston. Boston in 1770 was a tense city. British soldiers had been quartered there for 18 months, and the relationship between the redcoats, as the colonists called them, and the local population was hostile. British soldiers were paid poorly, and many of them moonlighted doing jobs that Boston workers also needed. There had been ongoing conflicts, fights in the street, mutual contempt, and daily friction of the kind that comes from being forced into close proximity with people you dislike. On the night of the 5th, a crowd gathered around a small group of British soldiers at the customs house. The crowd threw ice, stones, and garbage. The soldiers were jeered and threatened. In the confusion and noise and fear, someone gave the order to fire, or possibly someone in the crowd shouted something that sounded like fire, or possibly a soldier acted on his own. The historical record is genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain is that when it was over, 5 colonists were dead and 6 were wounded. The dead included Crispus Attucks, a man of mixed African and Native American descent who had been born into slavery and later escaped. Attucks was the first person killed in what would become the American Revolution. His identity was significant in ways that colonial propagandists did not always fully acknowledge. The revolution began in the blood of a black man. Adams and the colonial press went to work immediately. The event was labelled a massacre, which rather overstated what a confrontation between a crowd and a small group of soldiers had produced. Paul Revere produced an engraving depicting the soldiers firing in cold blood into a peaceful crowd that bore only a passing relationship to what had actually happened. The image circulated widely throughout the colonies. The Boston Massacre, as it was immediately called, became one of the most powerful pieces of anti-British propaganda of the entire pre-revolutionary period. Here is the part of the story that is almost always left out of the patriotic version. The British soldiers were put on trial for the killings, and they were defended by John Adams, Samuel Adams' cousin, and one of the most principled lawyers in colonial New England. Adams took the case because he believed that everyone, even British soldiers who had killed colonists, deserved a fair trial. He won acquittals for most of the soldiers, securing convictions on reduced charges for only 2. His willingness to defend the soldiers was an act of genuine moral courage in an inflamed political environment, and John Adams considered it one of the most important things he ever did. The Massachusetts Committee of Correspondence, established by Samuel Adams in 1772, was another piece of organizational genius. Committees of correspondence were networks for sharing political information and coordinating resistance between towns and colonies. They existed, in effect, as a shadow government that operated alongside and increasingly in opposition to the official colonial governments. By 1774, committees of correspondence linked the colonies together in a network that allowed political action to be coordinated across vast distances in a way that had never been possible before. Virginia had its own contribution to the pre-revolutionary political drama. Patrick Henry, a lawyer and orator of extraordinary power, had made his name in 1765 with a speech before the Virginia House of Burgesses on the Stamp Act that was, by contemporary accounts, so radical that some members whispered the word treason. Henry reportedly replied that if that be treason, make the most of it. Whether he said exactly those words is debated by historians. Whether he said something very like them is not. Henry had a gift for the memorable phrase that made him one of the most important voices of the revolutionary period. His rhetoric was pitched at the gut rather than the head. Where Jefferson wrote with cold precision and Adams argued with lawyerly thoroughness, Henry inflamed. His "Give me liberty" or "Give me death" speech, delivered in March 1775, may have been reconstructed after the fact by his biographer, but it captured something real about the emotional tenor of the moment. The committees of correspondence, the Sons of Liberty networks, the colonial newspapers, the preachers who were beginning to talk about liberty from their pulpits, all of these were building something, not yet a revolution, but the infrastructure of a revolution, the connections, the shared grievances, the organizational capacity, and the political culture that would make coordinated collective action possible when the moment came. Tea, parties, and intolerable acts. The Townshend Acts had been partially repealed in 1770, with Parliament removing the duties on everything except tea. Britain kept the tea tax specifically to assert the principle that it had the right to tax the colonies. This was, from a pragmatic standpoint, extraordinarily poor judgment. They gave up the revenue to preserve the principle, and then kept the principle in the one form most calculated to keep the argument alive. Tea was not just a beverage. As I mentioned earlier, it was culturally central to colonial life, particularly in New England. The tax on tea was a daily, tangible reminder of the constitutional conflict. Every cup of tea was a small act of submission. This is why the women of colonial households who organised tea boycotts, brewing herbal substitutes that they called Liberty tea with a kind of grim humour, were making a genuinely political gesture. The tea situation was further complicated in 1773 when Parliament passed the Tea Act, which actually lowered the price of tea in the colonies. The catch was that it gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales, cutting out colonial merchants who had been profiting from the tea trade, including some who had been profiting from illegal smuggling. The Tea Act was an attempt to make the taxed tea cheaper than smuggled Dutch tea, thus encouraging the colonists to accept the tax by making it economically painless. The colonists saw through this immediately. The issue was never really about the price of tea. It was about the right of Parliament to tax them at all. Cheaper taxed tea was not better than more expensive untaxed tea. It was a trap. On the night of December the 16th, 1773, about 116 men organised by the Sons of Liberty, under Samuel Adams' direction, disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbour, and methodically destroyed 342 chests of tea by throwing them into the harbour. The whole thing was quite well organised. The men were careful not to damage the ships themselves or steal any of the tea. They were making a political point, not a profit. The Boston Tea Party, as it would be called, was received in the colonies with a mixture of delight, discomfort, and alarm. Benjamin Franklin, then serving as colonial agent in London, argued that the destroyed tea should be paid for. John Adams was rather more enthusiastic. Most colonial leaders recognised that destroying private property, even in service of a political principle, was a significant escalation. Britain's response was overwhelming and, from a political standpoint, catastrophically counterproductive. In the spring of 1774, Parliament passed a series of acts that the colonists immediately dubbed the Intolerable Acts or the Coercive Acts. These included the Boston Port Act, which closed Boston Harbour until the tea was paid for, the Massachusetts Government Act, which effectively dissolved the Massachusetts colonial government and placed the colony under direct Crown control, the Administration of Justice Act, which allowed Crown officials accused of crimes in the colonies to be tried in England, and the Quartering Act, which required colonists to house British soldiers. To punish Massachusetts, which Parliament identified as the primary source of the trouble, was in British minds a targeted response. In colonial minds, it was an attack on all of them. If Parliament could dissolve the Massachusetts government and close Boston Harbour, it could do the same to any colony. The threat was not to Massachusetts alone, but to the principle of colonial self-governance everywhere. The colonies responded with a generosity toward Massachusetts that surprised even some of the people showing it. Other colonies sent food, money, and supplies to Boston. Virginia declared a day of fasting and prayer in solidarity. And the calls for a general colonial congress grew louder and more urgent. There is a phrase that political organisers use when trying to explain how to build a movement: do not make your opponent's argument for them. Britain, in passing the Intolerable Acts, was essentially making the colonial resistance's argument for them. Samuel Adams had been arguing for years that Britain intended to strip the colonists of their rights and liberties. The Intolerable Acts made him look prescient rather than paranoid. Moderate colonists who had been resistant to the idea of confrontation found it harder to maintain their moderation when Boston Harbour was closed and the Massachusetts government had been dissolved by parliamentary decree. The Intolerable Acts are in a way the moment when independence became, if not inevitable, then significantly more likely. Not because the colonists immediately moved toward independence, because they did not, but because the Acts destroyed the credibility of the moderate position that Parliament would eventually come to its senses and treat the colonies with the respect they deserved. The First Continental Congress. In September 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia was the holdout, gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. It was, in the history of American political development, a genuinely remarkable event. These men had never met as a collective body before. They came from colonies with very different interests and very different political cultures. They did not entirely trust one another, and yet they had come because the situation seemed to demand it. The Philadelphia they gathered in was the largest and most cosmopolitan city in British North America. It had grown enormously since William Penn founded it less than a century earlier. Its streets were broad and planned, its public buildings impressive, its markets active, its taverns full of conversation and argument. The State House where the delegates met, a building that would later be called Independence Hall, had been completed in 1753 and was the grandest public building in the colonies. The delegates represented a wide range of opinion. There were radicals like Samuel Adams and his cousin John Adams from Massachusetts, who had effectively already concluded that some form of confrontation with Britain was necessary. There were moderates like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania and Joseph Galloway, also of Pennsylvania, who wanted redress of grievances within the framework of the British Constitution. There were Southern planters like George Washington and Patrick Henry of Virginia, who were deeply invested in colonial autonomy, but not necessarily eager for outright conflict. The Congress produced several significant documents. The Declaration and Resolves laid out the colonial position. Parliament had no right to tax the colonies or legislate for their internal affairs. The colonies acknowledged the right of Parliament to regulate imperial trade, but nothing more. The document was a carefully argued statement of constitutional principle, not a declaration of independence. The Congress also created the Continental Association, a boycott agreement that committed all the colonies to refusing to import or consume British goods. Committees of inspection were to be established in every town to enforce compliance. This was a significant organisational step. It created a colonial-wide economic weapon and a network of enforcement committees that were, in effect, parallel governments operating alongside the official colonial structures. Perhaps most importantly, the Congress agreed to meet again the following May if the situation had not been resolved. They were not burning bridges. They were keeping options open while demonstrating clearly that the colonies were capable of unified action. Galloway's plan of union, which would have created an American Parliament that would share legislative authority with Westminster, was defeated by a narrow margin. This is one of those might-have-been moments of history. A genuine constitutional compromise was possible in 1774. Whether it would have held, whether Britain would have honoured it, whether the deeper tensions would have eventually produced conflict anyway, these are questions that cannot be answered. What we know is that the moderate solution was rejected narrowly, and events moved forward. The Congress adjourned in October 1774. The delegates went home and waited to see how Britain would respond. Britain's response, as we're about to see, was not the compromise the moderates had hoped for. Lexington, Concord, and the shot heard round the world. The winter of 1774 to 1775 was a season of military preparation on both sides. General Thomas Gage, the new military governor of Massachusetts, was in an impossible position. He commanded several thousand British soldiers in Boston, surrounded by a colonial population that was actively arming itself and openly hostile to his authority. He had been sending reports to London describing the situation accurately, including advice that force alone would not solve the problem. London was not interested in his advice. In April 1775, Gage received orders to take decisive action. He decided to send a force to seize the colonial militia's weapons and supplies stored at Concord, about 20 miles west of Boston, and to arrest the colonial leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were believed to be in the area. The colonists had their own intelligence network. Joseph Warren, a Boston physician and senior member of the Sons of Liberty, received word of the planned expedition on the night of April 18th. He sent 2 riders out to warn the countryside, William Dawes, who rode by land through Roxbury, and Paul Revere, who crossed by boat to Charlestown and rode north through Lexington. Revere's ride was not the solitary midnight gallop through a sleeping countryside that Longfellow's famous poem would later make it. He was one of several riders. He was stopped and briefly detained by a British patrol near Lexington. He never actually reached Concord. The man who completed the ride to Concord was a local physician named Samuel Prescott, who happened to be riding home late at night after visiting his fiancée and was recruited into the warning mission on the spot. History is full of people who end up in the wrong place at the right time, but Revere had accomplished his primary mission. When the British force of about 700 men arrived at Lexington at dawn on April 19th, they found approximately 77 militiamen drawn up on the green under the command of Captain John Parker. Parker knew his men were outnumbered nearly 10 to 1. According to later accounts, he told his men, "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." The British commander ordered the militia to disperse. The militia began to do so, but slowly. In the confusion and tension of that dawn moment, a shot was fired. No one knows who fired it, and no one is ever likely to know. It may have come from a militiaman. It may have come from a British soldier. It may have come from someone in the crowd watching from the side. What matters is that the shot triggered a British volley that killed 8 militiamen and wounded 10 more. The British force then marched on to Concord, where they found most of the supplies already removed or hidden. They searched the town, found little of value, and destroyed what they found. At the North Bridge, a brief exchange of fire occurred between British troops and a growing force of colonial militia. British soldiers were killed. The British forces then began what should have been an orderly retreat to Boston. What it became was something else entirely. The colonial militias of Massachusetts had been waiting for exactly this moment. Armed men poured out of every farm and town along the road between Concord and Boston. They took up positions behind stone walls, fences, trees and buildings, and as the British column marched past, they fired. The British troops, who were trained for open European-style battles, not for this kind of close-range ambush, suffered heavily. By the time they reached Boston, they had lost nearly 300 men, killed, wounded or missing. Colonial casualties were much lower. The battles of Lexington and Concord were not, in a strictly military sense, decisive engagements. They were skirmishes, but their political and psychological significance was enormous. The war had begun. British soldiers were dead on American soil. Colonial militia had stood and fought, and by the end of the day, had driven a large British force back to its base. Ralph Waldo Emerson, writing 60 years later, called the first shot at Concord the shot heard round the world. He was right. It was. By the next morning, approximately 15,000 colonial militia were besieging Boston. The revolution had moved from the realm of pamphlets and boycotts into the realm of armed conflict. The Second Continental Congress and a war already started. The delegates who gathered in Philadelphia in May 1775 for the Second Continental Congress arrived in a dramatically different situation than those who had met the previous autumn. When the First Congress had met, the argument was still primarily constitutional, still about rights and representation. By the time the Second Congress opened, men were dying. Congress faced an almost paradoxical challenge. They had a war on their hands, but they had not yet decided they wanted one. Most of the delegates still hoped for a negotiated settlement with Britain. Even as they authorized military action, even as they organized an army, they continued to profess loyalty to the Crown and hope for reconciliation. They sent what became known as the Olive Branch Petition to King George III in July 1775, begging him to intervene and prevent further conflict. George III declined to read it. This was not a small thing. The petition was a genuine last attempt at negotiated settlement, and the King's refusal to engage with it was one of the factors that moved moderate colonial opinion toward the conclusion that separation, not reform, was the only available path. But before they could seriously consider independence, Congress had to deal with the immediate military situation. The army besieging Boston was an unorganized collection of colonial militia from different colonies, with no unified command, no clear chain of authority, no standard supplies or equipment, and no coherent strategy. Turning this into something that could fight the British Army was an enormous challenge. Congress's choice for commander was George Washington, and it was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential personnel decisions in American history. Washington was not the most experienced or most brilliant military man available. Charles Lee and Horatio Gates were arguably more experienced professionally, but Washington had qualities that the situation required. He was from Virginia, which meant that his appointment represented the commitment of the southern colonies to a war that had so far been primarily a New England affair. He had presence and dignity and the appearance of authority. He was supremely politically reliable, neither vain in ways that would create political problems, nor ambitious in ways that would threaten civilian control. And he had a quality that the coming years would test repeatedly: the ability to endure catastrophe without losing the will to continue. Washington left Philadelphia for Cambridge in June 1775 to take command. What he found was both inspiring and alarming. Inspiring because the men were there, tens of thousands of them, genuinely committed to the cause. Alarming because they had almost no gunpowder, inadequate food and shelter, no professional military organization, and a tendency to go home when they felt like it. The Battle of Bunker Hill, which actually took place on nearby Breed's Hill on June 17, 1775, happened before Washington arrived. Colonial militia had fortified positions on the heights above Boston, and the British attacked rather than allowing the position to be established. The British took the hill, but at devastating cost. The colonials, who ran out of ammunition and were forced to withdraw, inflicted roughly 2 casualties on the British for everyone they suffered. The battle demonstrated that the colonial militia could fight, could hold professional soldiers in pitched combat, and could inflict serious damage even in defeat. The siege of Boston settled into a long, cold, uncomfortable standoff through the winter of 1775. The breakthrough came in the spring of 1776, when Henry Knox, a young Boston bookseller turned artillery officer, completed the extraordinary feat of dragging approximately 60 tons of captured cannon from Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain some 300 miles through winter wilderness. Washington used these cannon to fortify Dorchester Heights, which overlooked Boston Harbor. The British commander, William Howe, who had replaced Gage, had a choice: attack the heights and repeat the bloodbath of Bunker Hill, or evacuate. He evacuated. On March 17, 1776, the British left Boston. They would not return. Thomas Paine and the Power of Plain Words. In January 1776, a 47-page pamphlet was published in Philadelphia that changed the political conversation in the American colonies more profoundly and more rapidly than any other single document. It was called Common Sense. Its author was Thomas Paine, a recent immigrant from England who had been in the colonies for barely more than a year. Paine was a fascinating character. He had failed at nearly everything he had tried in England. He had been a corset maker, a sailor, a tax collector, and a teacher, and had not particularly distinguished himself at any of these. He had arrived in Philadelphia in November 1774 with a letter of introduction from Benjamin Franklin, whom he had met in London, and had begun writing for colonial newspapers. Common Sense was different from almost everything else in the colonial political literature. It did not argue from legal precedent or constitutional tradition. It argued from first principles, and it made an argument that no one else had yet made with this kind of directness and clarity. The colonies should not seek reconciliation with Britain. They should declare independence, not because of specific grievances about taxes, not because of constitutional violations, but because the very idea of monarchy was absurd and the British system was corrupt beyond reform. Paine's writing was accessible in a way that earlier colonial political writing had not been. John Adams' arguments were sophisticated and carefully reasoned, but they were written for educated readers. Dickinson's letters were well crafted, but required some political sophistication to fully appreciate. Paine wrote for everyone. He used plain language, vivid examples, and direct challenges to received wisdom that anyone who could read, and increasingly in the colonies that was most people, could follow and respond to. His attack on the institution of monarchy was particularly radical. He pointed out that the Bible itself expressed skepticism about kingship. He argued that hereditary monarchy, the idea that the right to govern should pass from father to son regardless of ability or merit, was fundamentally irrational. Why should the accident of birth determine who rules millions of people? Why should the colonists feel any particular loyalty to a king they had never seen, and who clearly did not have their interests at heart? He also articulated, perhaps more clearly than anyone had yet done, the argument that American independence would matter to the whole world. This was not just a colonial dispute. It was the beginning of a new political age, the first time in modern history that people had the opportunity to build a government from the ground up based on rational principles rather than historical accident. The cause of America is in a great measure the cause of all mankind, he wrote. Common Sense sold approximately 500,000 copies in its first year of publication, in a colonial population of roughly 2.5 million. This is, adjusted for population, roughly equivalent to a book selling 50 million copies in the United States today. It was a cultural phenomenon. It changed what it was permissible to say in colonial political discourse. Before Common Sense, arguing for independence was a radical fringe position. After it, arguing for reconciliation began to seem increasingly naive. Even John Adams, who had significant intellectual disagreements with Paine and did not particularly like him, acknowledged the pamphlet's enormous impact. What Paine had done was shift the political centre of gravity. He had made independence not just thinkable, but common sense. The Declaration of Independence. Writing the words, by the spring of 1776, the argument for independence was no longer radical. It had become mainstream. The colony of Virginia instructed its delegates to the Continental Congress to move for independence. Similar instructions came from North Carolina, Rhode Island, and others. In June 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia rose in Congress and moved a resolution declaring that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Congress appointed a committee of 5 to draft a formal declaration in case the resolution passed. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was chosen to write the first draft. He was 33 years old. Jefferson worked in a rented room on the second floor of a house at the corner of Market and 7th Streets in Philadelphia. He had brought a small portable writing desk with him from Virginia. The desk is now in the Smithsonian. He wrote by hand on plain paper with a quill pen. He worked for about 2 weeks on the draft. Why Jefferson? He was not the most senior member of the committee. John Adams was arguably more important politically. Franklin was more famous. Jefferson was chosen partly because he was from Virginia, the most important southern colony, and partly because he was known to write well. Adams later claimed that he had urged Jefferson to write it because Adams suspected he was too controversial a figure, and because Jefferson was a far better writer than himself. That last claim, from a man not known for underestimating his own abilities, says something about how good Jefferson's prose was. Jefferson later said that he did not consult books or pamphlets in writing the Declaration. He was trying to express the American mind, the common sense of the subject as it had developed over the previous decade of argument. He drew on John Locke's political philosophy, on the English radical tradition, on the arguments that colonial writers had been making since the Stamp Act crisis, and on his own considerable intellectual resources. The Declaration begins with what is now probably the most famous sentence in American political history. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That word self-evident is doing a great deal of work. Jefferson was not saying that the equality of all men was obvious from looking at the world, which it clearly was not, particularly in a society where slavery was legal. He was making a philosophical claim about the foundations of legitimate government. The equality of human beings in their fundamental dignity and rights was, in his framework, the starting point, the axiom from which everything else followed. Government derived its just powers from the consent of the governed. When government failed to protect rights, it could be altered or abolished. The bulk of the Declaration is actually a list of grievances against King George III, a legal brief making the case that the king had systematically violated the colonists' rights in ways that justified revolution. This section is less often read today, but it was the section that the delegates in Congress cared most about at the time, because it was the justification for an act that, if it failed, would result in their executions. Jefferson's original draft included a passage blaming the king for the slave trade, and for forcing slavery on an unwilling colonial population, which was historically dubious on multiple counts, but represented Jefferson's apparent attempt to put some distance between his philosophical commitments and his personal practice. This passage was removed by Congress, at the insistence of South Carolina, Georgia, and reportedly some northern delegates who had no wish to antagonize slavery-dependent southern colonies on the eve of independence. John Adams and Benjamin Franklin made relatively modest edits to Jefferson's draft. Congress then subjected it to what Jefferson later described, somewhat bitterly, as severe marking and cutting. In particular, the section on the slave trade was removed. The phrase sacred and undeniable that Jefferson had originally used before self-evident was changed. Approximately 25% of the original text was cut. Jefferson was unhappy with the edits. He was, by his own account, in anguish as the Congress cut his document. Franklin, sitting next to him, told him a story about a hatter who had ordered a sign for his shop reading John Thompson, hatter, makes and sells hats for ready money, with a picture of a hat. Before the sign was made, the hatter had asked various friends for their opinions, and each had suggested cutting a word, until nothing was left but the name and the picture. Franklin's point was clear: committee editing is painful but survivable. Jefferson was not entirely comforted. The finished declaration was a document of two registers. On one level, it was a specific legal and political argument about a specific conflict between a specific group of colonists and a specific king. On another level, it was a universal statement about the nature of human rights and the foundations of legitimate government that transcended its immediate context and became, over subsequent centuries, one of the most important political documents in world history. That universality was both its greatest achievement and its greatest source of tension. If all men are created equal, what about women? What about enslaved people? What about the indigenous nations whose land was being colonized? The signers did not ask these questions, or if they asked them, they did not answer them in ways that changed their behavior. But the words they wrote were larger than they knew, or perhaps in some cases larger than they intended. July 4th, 1776. On July 2nd, 1776, the Continental Congress voted to approve Richard Henry Lee's resolution for independence. 12 of the 13 colonial delegations voted yes. New York abstained, waiting for instructions from home. John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail that day saying he expected the 2nd of July to be celebrated by future generations with great solemnity as the most memorable epoch in the history of America. He was off by 2 days. July 4th was the day Congress formally approved the final text of the Declaration of Independence. It was also, as it happened, the day that the news of the independence vote was published in the Pennsylvania Evening Post, making it, in effect, the day the public learned what had happened. History runs on publication dates as much as it runs on event dates, and July 4th was when the news went out. The signing of the Declaration is somewhat complicated by the historical record. Most delegates signed on August 2nd, not July 4th. A few signed even later. John Hancock, as President of Congress, signed immediately on July 4th, which is how his signature ended up notably larger than everyone else's. The story that he wrote it large so King George could read it without his spectacles is probably apocryphal. John Hancock was not actually a man who needed an excuse to write his name large. The reaction across the colonies was a mixture of celebration and apprehension. In Philadelphia, the Declaration was read publicly on July 8th. People cheered. The royal arms were torn down from the State House. In New York, a crowd pulled down the gilded-lid statue of King George III that stood on the Bowling Green and reportedly melted it down to make musket balls for the Continental Army, which is a form of recycling that has a certain poetic quality. In Boston, the Declaration was read from the balcony of the old State House. The royal arms above the door were removed. The crowd celebrated. Abigail Adams, who attended with her children, wrote to her husband, "The bells rang, the privateers fired, and the multitudes shouted." She added, in her direct way, that she wished the sentiment had been applied equally to women and black Americans. The celebration, genuine as it was also shadowed by the knowledge of what independence meant practically. The colonies were now officially at war with the most powerful military empire on Earth. The British Army was at that moment landing on Staten Island with 32,000 men, the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever sent across the Atlantic. The Continental Army under Washington consisted of perhaps 19,000 men, poorly equipped and minimally trained. Independence had been declared. Now it had to be won. For the people whose lives were most shaped by the Declaration's language and least reflected in its protections, July 4th, 1776 was a complicated day. The estimated 500,000 enslaved people in the colonies heard the rhetoric of liberty and self-evident equality from people who owned them. Some heard freedom in that language and would later invoke it in arguments, petitions, and lawsuits demanding their own liberty. Others experienced it as nothing more than the sound of their enslavers congratulating themselves. Both responses were rational. The Declaration of Independence was not the founding of a perfect nation. It was the founding of an imperfect one that contained within it the seeds both of its ongoing injustices and of the tools that would eventually slowly and completely be used to address them. A war that nearly failed. The military history of the American Revolution is, for most of its duration, a history of near catastrophe repeatedly averted. Washington's genius was not primarily tactical. He lost more battles than he won. His genius was strategic and psychological. He understood that as long as the Continental Army existed as a fighting force, the revolution existed. The British could not win by winning battles. They would have to destroy the army, and destroying the army meant catching it. Washington spent most of the war not catching. The summer and fall of 1776 were disastrous. The British force that landed on Staten Island in July was commanded by General William Howe and his brother Admiral Richard Howe. In late August, the British attacked Washington's forces on Long Island in what became known as the Battle of Brooklyn Heights. Washington's army was outmaneuvered, nearly trapped, and lost about 1,500 men in the worst defeat of the war. Only a remarkably convenient foggy night allowed Washington to evacuate his army across the East River to Manhattan before the British could close the trap. The retreat continued through Manhattan, through the Bronx into New Jersey. Engagements at Fort Washington and Fort Lee cost the Continental Army thousands more men and enormous quantities of equipment. By December 1776, Washington had retreated across New Jersey to the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River with perhaps 2,400 men. The army was cold, hungry, poorly clothed, and increasingly desperate. Enlistments were expiring at the end of the year. If he could not do something to restore confidence in the cause, the Continental Army might simply dissolve. Thomas Paine, who had travelled with the army during the retreat, wrote a new pamphlet in those dark December days that opened with words that became famous. "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country." The pamphlet, The American Crisis, was read to the troops. Then Washington did something that combined tactical boldness with strategic necessity. On the night of December 25th, 1776, he led his army back across the Delaware River in boats, through a brutal sleet storm, and attacked the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey before dawn. The attack achieved complete surprise. 900 Hessians were captured. American casualties were minimal. A follow-up victory at Princeton in early January 1777 further improved the situation. The victories at Trenton and Princeton were not, in strictly military terms, hugely significant, but their timing and their symbolism made them transformational. Washington had demonstrated that the Continental Army could still fight, could still win, could still surprise the enemy. Enlistments were renewed. The army survived the winter. The Revolution survived. Valley Forge in the winter of 1777 to 1778 has become the defining image of American revolutionary endurance. Washington's army of about 11,000 men was encamped in the Pennsylvania Hills about 20 miles northwest of Philadelphia, which was by then occupied by the British. The army was in terrible condition. Food and clothing were inadequate. The men were underfed and badly clothed. Hundreds died of disease. The huts they built for shelter were cold and draughty. The overall condition was, by any ordinary standard, hopeless. What Valley Forge actually was, in addition to a genuine ordeal, was a training ground. A Prussian military officer named Friedrich Wilhelm August Heinrich Ferdinand von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge in February 1778. He had been sent by Benjamin Franklin, who was serving as American ambassador in Paris, with exaggerated claims about his previous military rank. Steuben spoke no English. He had to have his training commands translated through a chain of interpreters, and he was one of the most effective military trainers the war produced. Steuben drilled the Continental Army through the spring, teaching them to march in formation, to maneuver on a battlefield, to use their bayonets effectively, to load and fire in proper sequences. The army that came out of Valley Forge in the spring of 1778 was genuinely different from the one that had gone in. It was a real army, not just an armed mob. Martha Washington, along with the wives of several other officers, spent the winter at Valley Forge. The presence of civilian women at the camp was important psychologically and practically. They organised the care of sick soldiers and maintained the social life of the officer corps. Martha Washington was, throughout the Revolution, a stabilising presence at whatever camp her husband occupied. Turning points. Saratoga and France enters the war. The battle that changed the strategic shape of the Revolutionary War was fought not at Trenton or Valley Forge, but at Saratoga, New York in October 1777. And it was a victory achieved almost despite the American commander, not because of him. British General John Burgoyne had conceived an ambitious plan to end the war in the north. He would march south from Canada through the Lake Champlain corridor, link up with British forces coming north from New York City, and effectively divide New England from the rest of the colonies. It was a strategically sensible idea that failed entirely in execution, largely because the forces from New York City never showed up, and Burgoyne's army found itself far from its supply lines, deep in American territory, surrounded by hostile militia who had been learning from months of fighting exactly how to handle British regular forces in wooded terrain. At Saratoga, Burgoyne's army of about 5,800 men was surrounded and forced to surrender. It was the largest British surrender of the entire war and the most significant American military victory to that point. Saratoga mattered enormously for a reason that had nothing to do with the military situation in New York. It convinced France to enter the war on the American side. France had been watching the American Revolution with considerable interest. Not out of sympathy for colonial liberation necessarily. France's own colonial empire was not run on principles of self-determination, but France had been Britain's primary rival for a century and had just lost the 7 Years' War. The opportunity to humiliate Britain and chip away at its global power was irresistible. Benjamin Franklin had been in Paris since December 1776, conducting what was probably the most effective diplomatic mission in American history. Franklin was 70 years old, charming, famous, and infinitely sophisticated. He had cultivated his image as a wise American philosopher with great skill, appearing at the French court in simple American clothes when French aristocrats expected elaborate finery, and becoming something of a sensation in Parisian intellectual circles. The French had been providing covert aid to the Americans since 1776 through a fictional trading company called Rodriguez Hortales and Company, which funneled money, weapons and supplies to the Continental Army. After Saratoga, France was ready to go public. In February 1778, France and the United States signed formal treaties of alliance. France entered the war as America's ally, Spain joined the conflict in 1779, and the Dutch in 1780, though the Dutch involvement was primarily naval. What had begun as a colonial rebellion against Britain had become a global war. Britain now had to defend not just North America but the Caribbean, Gibraltar, India, and its home islands against a coalition of European powers. This strategic overextension was exactly what the Americans needed. The French alliance brought the revolution something it desperately needed: money, a real navy, and eventually French ground forces. The Marquis de Lafayette, a young French nobleman who had been serving with the Continental Army since 1777 on a volunteer basis, now represented a formal alliance rather than individual enthusiasm. The Comte de Rochambeau arrived in Newport, Rhode Island in 1780 with 6,000 French regular troops. The Continentals and their French allies would not fight a decisive battle together until 1781, but the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. Britain was fighting on too many fronts. Time was on the American side. The Southern Campaign and Yorktown. After the failure of the Northern strategy, the British shifted their attention to the southern colonies, believing they could find more loyalist support there and use it as the base for reconquering the continent from south to north. It was not an entirely irrational strategy. There were significant loyalist populations in the south. The Carolinas in particular had large communities of recent Scottish and Irish immigrants who had no particular revolutionary sentiment, and some who actively supported the crown. The British captured Savannah, Georgia in December 1778. Charleston, South Carolina fell in May 1780 in the largest American military defeat of the war, with over 5,000 Continental soldiers captured. British General Charles Cornwallis appeared to be making rapid progress. What followed in the South was a brutal guerrilla war that has been somewhat overshadowed in popular memory by the larger battles of the North, but was in many ways the most vicious fighting of the entire Revolution. Loyalist and Patriot forces carried out campaigns of ambush, reprisal, and counter-reprisal that resembled civil war more than conventional military conflict. Communities were divided, farms were burned, and the violence was personal in a way that conventional warfare was not. American partisan commanders, Thomas Sumter, Andrew Pickens, and most famously Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, used guerrilla tactics to harass British forces, disrupt supply lines, and prevent British control from extending into the countryside beyond their garrison towns. Marion in particular operated in the South Carolina Low Country with such effectiveness that British commanders found it impossible to pacify the region, no matter how many towns they held. Cornwallis won battles but could not achieve the political control he needed to make the Southern strategy work. At Kings Mountain in October 1780, a force of over 900 Loyalist troops was surrounded and virtually destroyed by Patriot militia in a battle in which no regular troops on either side participated. At Cowpens in January 1781, Brigadier General Daniel Morgan achieved one of the most tactically perfect American victories of the war, using a deliberate feigned retreat to lure the aggressive British cavalry commander Banastre Tarleton into a trap and destroying his force. These reverses did not destroy Cornwallis's army, but they severely damaged the Loyalist cause in the south. The people who might have supported the British were learning that British control was not permanent, and that siding with the Crown could mean brutal reprisals from Patriot neighbours once the British moved on. Cornwallis moved north into Virginia, where he began a destructive raid campaign, hoping to draw Washington south. The final campaign of the war began to take shape in the summer of 1781 through a convergence of planning, luck, and French naval power. Washington and Rochambeau were considering an attack on New York. Then intelligence reached them that a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was sailing for the Chesapeake. The possibility of trapping Cornwallis on the Virginia Peninsula between a land force and a naval force presented itself. Washington moved fast. In a feat of logistical and operational brilliance, he and Rochambeau marched their forces south from New York through New Jersey and Pennsylvania, successfully deceiving the British in New York about their destination until it was too late to intervene. De Grasse's fleet defeated a British relief fleet at the Battle of the Chesapeake in early September, a naval engagement so crucial to American independence that it is astonishing it is not better known. The sea was closed. Cornwallis was trapped. The siege of Yorktown began on September 28, 1781. Cornwallis was surrounded by approximately 17,000 American and French troops. His force of about 8,000 had no way out. The British fleet that might have rescued him had been defeated. His appeals to the British commander in New York for relief went unanswered. The siege proceeded methodically. French and American engineers and artillery systematically dismantled the British defences. Cornwallis made a desperate attempt to evacuate his army across the York River to Gloucester Point on the night of October 16th, but a storm scattered the boats. It was over. On October 17th, 1781, Cornwallis sent out a drummer beating a request for parley. He would surrender the next day. According to tradition, as the British troops marched out to lay down their arms, their band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." Whether this is precisely accurate is uncertain, but it is emotionally true. The world had been turned upside down. The greatest empire on earth had been defeated by a collection of colonial farmers and their French allies. Cornwallis did not personally appear for the surrender, claiming illness. His sword was surrendered by a deputy. Washington, declining to accept a sword from a subordinate, had his own deputy, Major General Benjamin Lincoln, receive it. The war was not quite over, but it was effectively won. The Treaty of Paris, and what was won. The fighting after Yorktown was minor. Britain retained its forces in New York and Charleston for another year, and some fighting continued in the south and at sea. But Yorktown had broken Britain's will to continue the war. Lord North's government fell. New ministers who favoured negotiation came to power. Peace talks began in Paris. The American negotiators were Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. They were instructed by Congress to defer to France in the negotiations, but they quickly concluded that French interests in the final settlement did not align perfectly with American interests, and began negotiating separately and secretly with the British. This was diplomatically irregular. The French, when they found out, were not pleased, but the Americans got a better deal as a result. The Treaty of Paris, signed on September 3rd, 1783, was extraordinarily favourable to the United States. Britain recognised American independence. The boundaries of the new nation were set at the Great Lakes to the north, the Mississippi River to the west, and Florida to the south. Americans received the right to fish in the waters off Newfoundland. Both sides agreed to honour pre-war debts. What Britain had given up was more than might have been expected. The territorial boundaries granted the new nation access to an enormous interior that the British might have kept for themselves. Some historians believe the British were deliberately generous in the peace terms, hoping that a strong United States would serve as a commercial partner and a buffer against French ambitions in the Americas. Independence on paper was one thing, independence in practice was another. The new nation had serious problems. The war had been financed largely through debt, both foreign loans from France and the Netherlands, and domestic currency issued by Congress that had depreciated massively. Continental money had become proverbially worthless, hence the phrase "not worth a continental." The Continental Army had not been fully paid. Veterans were owed back pay and the pensions they had been promised. The relationship with indigenous peoples was entirely unresolved. The Treaty of Paris drew lines on maps without any reference to the nations that actually lived on the land being claimed. Indigenous peoples who had allied with either Britain or the Americans found themselves largely abandoned by their respective patrons. The new United States claimed sovereignty over territory that it did not actually control and could not, in the short term, effectively govern. The Loyalists, perhaps a fifth of the colonial population who had remained loyal to the Crown, faced persecution, property confiscation, and exile. About 80,000 of them left the United States primarily for Canada, the Caribbean, and Britain. Their departure removed a significant portion of the educated, propertied class from some regions, and the enslaved people whose labour had built so much of colonial wealth found their status essentially unchanged by independence. The Declaration's rhetoric about natural rights had inspired thousands of them to seek freedom by escaping to the British lines, and the British, in a move that owed more to military strategy than humanitarian conviction, had promised freedom to enslaved people who reached their lines. Perhaps 50 to 100,000 enslaved people were liberated during the war by reaching British forces or by taking advantage of the chaos. The revolution accelerated the spread of gradual abolition in the northern states, where the economic stakes of slavery were lower. It did nothing for the South. The world that had been won in 1783 was not the world the Declaration had described. It was smaller, messier, more compromised. But it was real, and it was a beginning. The Articles of Confederation and the first attempt at governing. The 13 states had been fighting a war together for 8 years, but that did not mean they had figured out how to govern themselves together. The Articles of Confederation, the first constitution of the United States, had been drafted in 1777 and finally ratified in 1781, just in time to provide a legal framework for the end of the war, but not much time to prove itself before independence was won. The Articles created a Congress of the Confederation in which each state had one vote, regardless of population. There was no executive branch, there was no national judiciary. Congress could not levy taxes directly. It could request money from the states, but had no power to compel them to pay. It could not regulate commerce between states. Any amendment required unanimous consent of all 13 states, which effectively made the document unamendable. The Articles were designed this way deliberately. The men who drafted them had just fought a revolution against what they perceived as excessive centralized power. They were deeply suspicious of any national government strong enough to override the wishes of individual states. The Articles reflected that suspicion. The result was a government that was, by design, too weak to govern effectively. The problems became apparent quickly. The national government could not pay its debts. The interest on the war debt went unpaid. Veterans who had been promised pensions received paper that was essentially worthless. State governments imposed tariffs on goods from other states, hampering commerce. The currency situation was chaotic, with different states issuing different paper money of wildly varying value. Without the ability to regulate commerce or enforce trade agreements, the United States was a poor partner for foreign trade. Spain closed the Mississippi River to American navigation in 1784, cutting off the agricultural produce of the interior from its most natural route to market. This was a serious economic blow, and a demonstration that foreign powers did not take the new nation seriously as a diplomatic force. The crisis that convinced many political leaders that something had to change was Shays' Rebellion in 1786 to 1787. Daniel Shays was a former Continental Army captain and farmer in western Massachusetts. He and thousands of farmers like him were facing economic hardship. Their farms were being seized for non-payment of debts by courts that were also demanding payment in hard currency that most rural people simply did not have. They petitioned for relief. The state government, dominated by coastal merchant interests, ignored them. In the fall of 1786, armed groups of farmers began preventing courts from sitting and foreclosing on farms. In January 1787, Shays led a force of about 2,000 men in an attack on the federal arsenal at Springfield, Massachusetts. The state militia, funded by a private subscription from Boston merchants, when the federal government proved unable to help, suppressed the rebellion. Shays' Rebellion frightened the established political class across the country. The inability of the federal government to respond to a domestic uprising was alarming. The spectre of social disorder, of debtors rising against creditors, of the revolution turning into something more radical than the founders had intended was deeply unsettling. George Washington, who had been watching the political situation with growing alarm from his retirement at Mount Vernon, wrote that we are fast verging to anarchy and confusion. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and others who'd been arguing for years that the Articles needed to be replaced were now finding a much more receptive audience. The political momentum toward a new constitutional framework was building. The question was whether the men who would attempt to create it could actually agree on anything. The Constitutional Convention. In May 1787, 55 delegates gathered in Philadelphia for what was officially called a convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. What they actually ended up doing was considerably more radical, throwing out the Articles entirely and writing a new constitution from scratch. The convention met in the same building, the Pennsylvania State House, where the Declaration of Independence had been debated and signed 11 years earlier. The delegates agreed to meet in secret, a decision that was enormously consequential because it allowed them to speak frankly, change their minds, and make compromises that they might not have been able to make if their every word were being reported publicly. The secrecy has sometimes been criticized as anti-democratic, but it was also practically necessary. The constitution that emerged would not have survived the drafting process in full public view. The compromises required were too difficult, the disagreements too fundamental, to withstand the pressure of public scrutiny at every stage. The presiding officer was George Washington, whose presence lent the convention a legitimacy and authority it could not otherwise have had. Washington barely participated in the debates. He did not need to. His presence was the statement. The most respected man in America was sitting at the front of the room. This would produce something serious. The intellectual driving force of the convention was James Madison, a small, quiet, remarkably well-prepared delegate from Virginia who had spent the months before the convention reading everything he could find about the history of republics and confederacies, looking for lessons about what made them succeed or fail. He had produced a detailed memorandum on the vices of the political system of the United States that amounted to a diagnosis of everything wrong with the Articles of Confederation and a preliminary sketch of what might replace them. Madison's Virginia Plan, which Edmund Randolph presented on behalf of the Virginia delegation at the start of the convention, proposed a strong national government with a bicameral legislature, an executive, and a judiciary. Representation in the legislature would be proportional to population, which advantaged large states like Virginia. The smaller states immediately objected. Under the New Jersey Plan, proposed by William Paterson, Congress would retain the one-state, one-vote structure of the Articles. The division between large state and small state interests threatened to break up the convention entirely. The resolution, the Connecticut Compromise or Great Compromise proposed by Roger Sherman, was elegant in its simplicity. There would be two chambers in the legislature. In the House of Representatives, seats would be apportioned by population, satisfying the large states. In the Senate, every state would have 2 senators regardless of size, satisfying the small states. Both chambers would have to pass legislation, giving both sides a check on the other. This is still how the United States Congress works today. If you have ever wondered why Rhode Island and California each get 2 senators, despite the fact that California has roughly 60 times Rhode Island's population, now you know. It is a bargain struck in the summer of 1787 to keep the small states in the room. The most troubling compromise of the convention concerned slavery. The southern states insisted that their enslaved population be counted for purposes of congressional representation. The northern states objected that you could not count people as population for representation purposes if you also refused to count them as people for any other purpose. The compromise, deeply ugly, was the 3/5 compromise. Enslaved people would count as 3/5 of a person for purposes of both representation and direct taxation. The 3/5 compromise was not an endorsement of slavery, but it was an accommodation of it, and a significant one. It gave the slave states greater representation in Congress than they would have had if only free citizens were counted. This extra representation protected slavery politically for decades. The Constitution also included provisions protecting the slave trade until 1808 and requiring the return of escaped enslaved people to their owners. The founding generation made a bargain. They sacrificed the principle of universal liberty to achieve the practical goal of a functioning union. Whether this bargain was morally defensible, whether there was any alternative that could have produced union, whether the cost paid in human bondage was too high, these are questions that do not have simple answers and that Americans have been arguing about ever since. The convention also debated and resolved questions about the executive branch. An independent executive had been controversial, with some delegates worried that it would become a monarchy in Republican clothing. The solution was a president elected indirectly through an electoral college, serving a fixed term with defined and limited powers. The first president would obviously be Washington. Everyone in the room knew that, and Washington's character and principles made a strong executive more politically acceptable than it might otherwise have been. The Constitution was signed on September 17, 1787. 39 of the 55 delegates who had attended the convention signed it. Several refused, including Virginia's George Mason, who objected to the absence of a Bill of Rights. The ratification process was contentious. The Constitution required ratification by 9 of 13 states. The debates in state ratifying conventions were among the most sophisticated political arguments in American history. The Federalist Papers, 85 essays written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, and published in New York newspapers under the pseudonym Publius, made the case for ratification with a combination of political theory, practical argument, and rhetorical skill that has never been matched in American political writing. The Anti-Federalists, who opposed ratification, also made powerful arguments. They worried about the concentration of power in the national government. They feared a distant federal authority unaccountable to ordinary people. They demanded a Bill of Rights protecting individual liberties against governmental overreach. The promise to add a Bill of Rights was crucial to securing ratification. New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify in June 1788, technically making the Constitution operative. Virginia and New York, crucial large states, ratified shortly after. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, was drafted by Madison and ratified by the states in 1791. The Constitution that emerged from Philadelphia was not a perfect document. Its framers knew it was not perfect. Benjamin Franklin, in his closing speech to the convention, said that he had experienced the wonder of finding himself in agreement with the document despite not thinking it perfect. and that he doubted whether any convention could produce a better constitution. He was probably right about that. What the convention had produced was, given its constraints, remarkable. A framework for a republican government capable of governing a large, diverse, expanding nation, a structure that balanced competing interests without suppressing them entirely. A document that contained within it both the protection of slavery and the mechanisms, however difficult to use, for eventually addressing it. The legacy. What Independence Day really means. Every year on the 4th of July, Americans gather for fireworks and barbecues and parades and various forms of celebration that range from deeply solemn to cheerfully chaotic. Children wave sparklers, military bands play, politicians give speeches. The founding is remembered, celebrated, and mythologized in ways that are sometimes accurate, sometimes embellished, and always revealing of what the people doing the remembering value most. What does Independence Day actually mean? That is a question worth sitting with, because the answer is not simple and has never been simple. It means, at the most basic level, the anniversary of the date on which the Continental Congress approved the text of a document declaring that the American colonies were no longer part of the British Empire, and were, from that moment, free and independent states. That much is factual and not contested. But July 4th has never been only about facts. It has always been about interpretation, about what the founding meant and what it was for, about whose story it tells, and those interpretations have been contested from the very beginning. In the decades after independence, the founding generation fell into bitter partisan dispute almost immediately. The men who had fought together for independence disagreed, sometimes furiously, about what that independence required. Hamilton and Jefferson, both founders, both signers in symbolic terms through their deep involvement in the Revolution, had entirely different visions of what America should become. Hamilton's America was commercial, industrial, aligned with Britain, administered by a strong central government. Jefferson's America was agrarian, republican, aligned with France, a decentralized confederation of self-governing communities. These were not minor disagreements. They were disagreements about the fundamental character of the nation, and they have echoed through every generation of American politics since. The question of slavery haunted the founding from the moment the Declaration was signed. The rhetoric of liberty and equality was powerful enough to be taken seriously by the people it was designed to exclude. In 1777, African Americans in Massachusetts petitioned for their freedom on the grounds that the revolutionary principles the colonists were fighting for applied to them equally. Elizabeth Freeman, an enslaved woman in Massachusetts, sued for her freedom in 1781 on the grounds of the Massachusetts state constitution's assertion that all men are born free and equal. She won. Her case, along with others, effectively ended slavery in Massachusetts. Over the following decades, the tension between the founding ideals and the reality of slavery grew more acute, not less. As the cotton economy made slavery in the South more economically entrenched, the gap between the Declaration's promise and the nation's practice became more glaring. Abolitionists pointed to the Declaration constantly. Frederick Douglass, in his extraordinary speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," delivered in 1852, made the argument with devastating precision. The 4th of July was a day of joy and celebration for white Americans, and a day of sorrow and bitter irony for black Americans, because the nation whose founding they were celebrating still held more than 3 million people in chains. Douglass was not rejecting the founding ideals. He was demanding that they be taken seriously. The founding documents, in his reading, were not a defense of slavery but a condemnation of it. The promises of the Declaration were not historical curiosities. They were, in his words, the very ring-bolts to which the nation was fastened. They were the tools with which slavery could be destroyed if Americans were willing to use them. The Civil War, fought from 1861 to 1865, was in a profound sense a second founding. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in 1865, the 14th, which guaranteed equal citizenship and due process in 1868, and the 15th, which prohibited racial discrimination in voting rights in 1870, were constitutional expansions of the founding promise. They were also acknowledgement that the original founding had left something fundamental undone. But the Reconstruction Amendments were not the end of the story either. The rollback of Reconstruction in the 1870s and 1880s, the establishment of Jim Crow segregation, the disenfranchisement of black voters through violence, legal manipulation and terror, the century of systematic exclusion from the political and economic life of the nation that followed, All of these were part of the story too. The founding promise was made, partially honoured, betrayed, and fought over again and again. The Declaration's promise that all men are created equal has been the most contested sentence in American political history. It has been used to argue for the rights of women, for the rights of workers, for the rights of immigrants, for the rights of LGBTQ Americans, for the rights of every group that has found itself excluded from the promise of equal citizenship. It has been used against every one of those causes by people who argued that the founders did not mean to include this particular group. The argument has never been settled once and for all. It just keeps going. That is, in a certain light, exactly what you would expect from a founding document written by people who were, in many ways, more radical than they knew. They wrote words whose implications exceeded their own willingness to live by them. They planted seeds they did not intend to grow. They created a standard against which their own failures could be measured and found wanting. The founding generation was not a group of demigods. They were human beings with the prejudices, limitations, and contradictions of their time. Washington was a slaveholder who freed his enslaved workers in his will, but not during his lifetime. Jefferson was a slaveholder who wrote the most famous words about human equality in American history, and seems never to have resolved the contradiction. Adams was one of the more intellectually honest of the founders about the complexity of what they were doing, including the slavery question, but he was also capable of signing the Alien and Sedition Acts, which represented a significant assault on civil liberties. They were not perfect. They produced an imperfect document and an imperfect nation, but they produced something, a framework, a set of principles, a political system that, with all its contradictions and compromises, contained within it the possibility of change, of improvement, of expansion. The Constitution has been amended 27 times since it was ratified. The most important amendments expanded the circle of citizenship and rights far beyond what the founders envisioned. This is not a failure of the founding vision. It is, in some sense, its fulfillment. Independence Day has different meanings for different Americans, and that is appropriate because America is not one thing. It is the slave owner writing about liberty, and the enslaved person hearing those words and deciding they apply to him too. It is the immigrant standing in front of a flag and taking an oath and meaning every word. It is the veteran at the parade who has served a country that is not perfect, and whose service is real anyway. It is the child watching fireworks without knowing or caring about any of this, just delighted by the light and the sound. It is, among other things, the memory of a moment in 1776 when a group of people, flawed and brave and inconsistent and remarkable, declared that certain truths were self-evident, that all people are created equal, that they have rights that governments cannot take away, that when a government fails to protect those rights, the people have the right and the responsibility to change it. Those words were radical when they were written. They remain radical when taken seriously. They have never been fully achieved. They keep being invoked by people who intend to take them more seriously than their authors did. That is the most honest version of what Independence Day means. Not the simple celebration of a perfect founding, but the ongoing argument about what those founding promises actually require. The conversation that started in 1776 and has never stopped. It is a conversation worth having. It is a country worth arguing about. And the argument itself, the fact that people still invoke the Declaration, still demand that its promises be honoured, still fight over what equality and liberty actually require, is maybe the most American thing of all. And so the story of American independence reaches its resting place. Not an ending exactly, because the story has never quite ended, but a pause. A moment to set down the weight of all those years and all those arguments, and all those complicated human beings and let them settle into quiet. We began tonight in a world that was already ancient, a continent alive with people and history long before the Revolution. We moved through the slow collision of worlds, the building of colonies, the accumulation of grievances, the crystallization of arguments, the sound of the first shots at Lexington and Concord, the careful drafting of extraordinary words in a rented room in Philadelphia. We passed through the valley of near failure, through Valley Forge and the retreats and the moments when the whole enterprise seemed likely to collapse. We came out the other side through Saratoga and Yorktown, through the improbable negotiations that produced an improbably favourable peace. We watched as the new nation struggled to govern itself, as the Constitution was argued into existence through compromise and heat, as the first amendments were added to protect the individual from the government that had been created. And we tried, at the end, to be honest about what all of it means, the brilliance and the blindness, the radical promise and the incomplete fulfillment, the story that is still going. This has been a long journey tonight. Through deep history and a living argument, through triumph and disaster, through the ordinary and the extraordinary lives of people who made a revolution and a nation and left both of them unfinished, as all real things are left unfinished to be worked on by whoever comes after. Let the history settle now, let the fireworks fade, let the speeches and the arguments and the debates go quiet for the moment. Somewhere tonight, across a vast country that was once 13 struggling colonies on the edge of an ocean, people are watching light in the sky and being briefly, purely happy about nothing more complicated than the light. That's allowed. History is heavy. Let it rest for a little while. Close your eyes, breathe slowly. Let the long story of how this country came to be drift through your thoughts, like the smoke from a fireworks display. Beautiful and dissolving, already past, already becoming memory. The work continues tomorrow. Tonight, rest. You have travelled far enough. You're where you're supposed to be. The story will be here when you wake up, still unfinished, still worth the telling. Good night.